Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. We'll begin now with story 1, the matchlock in the forest, Jamestown's first militia. In the spring of 1607, 3 small English ships floated up the wide brown waters of the James River, their wooden hulls heavy with passengers, livestock, gunpowder, and hope. It was not the first attempt to establish a foothold on the American continent, but for the men aboard the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, it might as well have been. They were not trained soldiers, nor hardened adventurers. Most were tradesmen, merchants, and laborers, with only a few bearing the title of gentlemen. Yet they all soon became warriors of a kind. There was no standing army. There were no barracks. Instead, there was only a promise from the Virginia Company that this land would be profitable, that gold, or something like it, waited in the dense thickets of Virginia. It was not long before they discovered otherwise. The matchlock, weapon of a bygone age. The first organized defense of Jamestown did not rely on strategy or discipline. It relied on the matchlock musket, a weapon that, even by 1607 standards, was already bordering on obsolete. A matchlock musket is not something designed for the wilderness. It is long, often nearly 5 feet in length, with a barrel that must be reloaded after each shot. It required a smoldering match, a slow-burning cord to ignite the gunpowder in the flash pan. In the rainy, humid marshlands of Virginia, keeping a match lit was an act of constant attention. The process of firing the weapon was both delicate and time-consuming. You would bite open a powder cartridge, pour powder into the barrel, ram home a lead ball with wadding, prime the pan, then hope your match was still burning. Each soldier had to carry several feet of the smoldering match, often wound around their body or kept burning at both ends. It smoked constantly, revealing your position in the woods. In a land of stealth and shadow, it was a liability. Still, it was the only firearm most of the settlers had, and so they trained with it, slowly and poorly. First contact and first fear. When the English made landfall, they met Powhatan tribes not as enemies, but as uncertain neighbors. Early encounters were often tense but peaceful, marked by cautious exchanges of gifts and words through interpreters. Yet violence soon followed. Small incidents spiraled, a missing axe, a hunting party mistaken for a raid, and then came the retaliatory attacks. Arrows pierced thatched roofs, ambushes at dawn, death in the reeds. The English, with their matchlocks, found themselves constantly outmaneuvered. The Powhatan used terrain, silence, and timing. They moved swiftly through forests the English did not understand. In contrast, the English defenders stood behind crude palisades with slow-loading guns and no cavalry, sweating through their armor and doublets in the heat. So the settlers began digging. The fort that wasn't a fortress. Jamestown was not originally a military outpost, but it became one by necessity. The triangular fort they built was made of wood-sharp stakes driven into the mud, bound together by sweat and desperation. There were no cannon at first, no elevated ramparts, and food was scarce. Even still, every man was expected to serve in defense. They rotated night watches. Every able-bodied settler, from carpenter to cook, took turns guarding the perimeter. Shifts were long, weapons unreliable, and most had no experience with them. When an alarm was raised, panic often replaced protocol. By the fall of 1607, nearly half the original settlers were dead from disease, starvation, or skirmishes. Captain John Smith, a former soldier, tried to impose order. He taught basic tactics, drills, and formations. Yet few could execute them under pressure. A matchlock was nearly useless in a surprise attack. So many resorted to sidearms, blades, hatchets, and pikes once the powder ran out or the match extinguished. The dream of a profitable colony began to give way to a daily fight for survival. Weapons beyond the gun. Interestingly, many of the most effective weapons in these early years weren't firearms at all. the English quickly learned to adapt. Axes were carried not only for chopping timber but for defense. Short swords, leftovers from Elizabethan warfare, became more reliable than muskets. Longbows, yes, even the ancient English longbow were sometimes revived, when powder supplies ran low or rain made matchlocks impossible to use. More importantly, the settlers began to learn from the Powhatan themselves. They saw how the native warriors carried light spears, wore no armor, and moved with speed. They observed ambush techniques, watched how warriors used reeds and swamp cover, and slowly, reluctantly, began to emulate aspects of these tactics. But there were limits. Cultural arrogance, combined with rigid military thinking, meant that the settlers were slow to fully embrace a new way of fighting. They clung to matchlocks and European methods long after they proved ineffective in the New World's forests. And yet survival demanded change. The martial routine of boredom. By 1609, the Jamestown militia was something like a formal unit, not professional, not disciplined, but it had routine. Daily drills, weapon cleaning, watch rotations, practice formations. It was tedious, underpaid, and exhausting, and it became the settlers' new normal. Interestingly, the psychological impact of this routine was as important as the military one. Men who had never fought before became accustomed to the idea of violence. They learned how to load a weapon in the dark, how to respond to alarms, how to fight with a pike when the gun misfired. These were not elite warriors, but they were becoming soldiers. It's worth asking, in what way did these early militias, forged by necessity and boredom, shape the American idea of the citizen soldier? Could the pattern of voluntary, under-resourced, self-trained militias have started right here in the mud of Jamestown, a colony at war with itself? Of course, danger didn't just come from outside the palisade. Internal conflict was constant. Some refused to work, others stole rations. Accusations of cowardice or treason led to punishments ranging from public shamming to execution. The line between military discipline and colonial governance blurred. John Smith once declared that "he that will not work shall not eat." But in times of danger, it might also have been said, "he that will not fight shall not live." By winter, starvation returned, powder ran low, the swamp froze, and still the men practiced with their matchlocks. Still they marched, drilled, and posted guards at dusk. They were not defending a nation. They were not fighting for ideology. They were simply trying not to die. And yet by surviving, they laid the foundation for something far larger than themselves. Unresolved thought. If Jamestown's defenders were slowly learning how to fight in the forest, how did their transformation shape later American warfare? And what tactics from this forgotten militia would echo through future battles on this continent? By 1610, the English settlers at Jamestown were no longer simply colonists. They were, in the words of one observer, besieged survivors. The matchlock musket, heavy and impractical as it was, had become a tool of daily habit, carried during every outing, cleaned during every lull in labor, and fired whenever tension turned to violence. Yet something deeper than the weapon itself had changed. The forest had become both enemy and teacher, and the settlers, those who had not succumbed to starvation, disease, or despair, were learning its cruel lessons. Powhatan Confederacy, not a monolith but a machine. To understand how the Jamestown militia evolved, one must first understand who they were fighting. The Powhatan Confederacy was not a tribe in the singular sense, but a loosely allied group of more than 30 Algonquian-speaking communities. Each had its own leaders, customs, and relationships with both each other and the English, but all acknowledged, in some form, the authority of Wahunsenacawh, known to the English as Chief Powhatan. He was not a warlord in the European mold. He did not command armies in uniform, nor issue formal declarations of war. Instead, he ruled through tribute, influence, and kinship. Violence, when it occurred, was strategic and limited raids, not battles. The goal was pressure, not annihilation. But the English did not understand this. When a Powhatan war party attacked a hunting group, the English saw treachery. When the Powhatan withheld corn during the winter, they saw betrayal. And when emissaries from Powhatan villages came to negotiate, they were viewed with suspicion or even arrested. As tensions rose, violence spiraled into something darker. The First Anglo-Powhatan War, 1609–1614. What followed was not a war in the traditional sense. There were no great campaigns or decisive battles. Instead, it was a series of ambushes, reprisals, raids, and retaliations fought across creeks, cornfields, and forest paths. The settlers were woefully unprepared. Most had no military training. Their armor-thick breastplates and helmets from earlier European wars offered little protection against arrows and made movement nearly impossible in swampy terrain. Their matchlocks took too long to reload, and their limited powder was often damp and unreliable. Yet slowly, the settlers adapted. John Smith, wounded in a gunpowder explosion and sent back to England in 1609, had laid the groundwork for defensive thinking, but his departure left the colony in chaos. What followed was the infamous Starving Time, in which only 60 of the 500 settlers survived the winter. The men who emerged from that experience were no longer novices. They were hardened, if traumatized. They began launching their own raids, burning native villages, seizing food stores, taking hostages, and they began learning from their opponents. They stopped wearing full armor. Instead, they used lighter garments, thick leather jerkins, or layered cloth that allowed for faster movement. They carried smaller weapons, cutlasses, axes, and short firearms when available. More importantly, they started using the terrain. They built ambush points. They patrolled in pairs. They began to move more quietly, ditching their ceremonial military formations for looser, more organic scouting lines. The forest, in essence, had reshaped their behavior. The gunpowder economy. Firearms were scarce, but even more precious was gunpowder. Manufactured in England, it could not be reliably produced in the colony during these early years. A single keg of powder became a commodity more valuable than gold. Trade with native groups, even those hostile to the Powhatan, sometimes included powder. The settlers offered metal tools, glass beads, and woven cloth in exchange for intelligence, food, or materials. On at least one occasion, a small war party of English settlers agreed not to retaliate against a village in exchange for 5 pounds of gunpowder. This informal diplomacy was often undocumented but essential. Gunpowder was also rationed. Men were issued specific amounts before patrols and encouraged not to waste shots on warning volleys or celebratory salutes. It is notable that some settlers began crafting makeshift alternatives. Sulfur, saltpeter, and charcoal were gathered in the hope of creating local powder stores. These experiments were mostly unsuccessful, but they marked the beginning of a military economy in Virginia, one not based on professional standing armies, but on scrappy improvisation. The rise of the Virginia fighting man. By 1611, Lord de la Warr Thomas West had assumed leadership of the colony. Unlike Smith, he was a nobleman with military experience in Ireland, where he had fought during the brutal 9 Years' War. He brought with him a new philosophy: total war. He ordered scorched earth campaigns. Crops were destroyed, villages burned, survivors killed or enslaved. De la Warr's tactics were undeniably effective, and the Powhatan were pushed further back into the forests. But they also escalated the conflict and set the tone for future colonial warfare marked by brutality, scorched land, and the targeting of civilians. Under his rule, the English militia became more structured. Men were grouped into squads based on skill. Those with firearms formed musket lines, while others took on support roles, carrying powder, guarding stores, scouting ahead. And yet this was not a professional army. These were farmers by day, soldiers by necessity. Their routine still involved clearing fields, building structures, and cooking meals. But always they kept their weapons close. This model would persist for centuries in American military history. The idea of the civilian soldier, of men who bore arms not as a profession but as a duty. Defensive innovations. By now, the fort at Jamestown had been rebuilt and reinforced. Cannon delayed in transport finally arrived and were mounted at key positions. Earthworks were added. More importantly, the militia began building satellite defenses, small watchtowers, signal stations, and even concealed rifle pits along the roads leading to the fort. The settlers also developed a system of alarm. Horns were sounded in sequence. Signal fires were lit. Messengers, often teenage boys or native allies from rival tribes, were sent by foot to warn of approaching danger. Inside the fort, every man had an assigned post. Drills were standardized, and a makeshift armory was built, part warehouse, part forge, part powder magazine. Still, they could not always prevent attack. In 1613, a surprise raid nearly breached the walls during a shift change. The attackers set fire to the outer palisade and loosed arrows into the compound. Only a lucky wind and the quick action of a few guards prevented total destruction. This led to one of the most defining changes in the militia, the introduction of constant watches. No hour of the day would pass without a man on guard. No path would go unpatrolled, and no weapon, no matter how rusted, would go uninspected. It was not an efficient system, but it was one born of trauma. The hidden cost of constant readiness. What did it do to a person to be always afraid? To live in a community where every sound might be danger, and every walk outside the walls might be your last. Men slept in shifts. Paranoia became common. So did accusations of cowardice or treason. Punishments were harsh. One man caught sleeping at his post was tied to a stake outside the fort for 24 hours within arrow range. The monotony of military life, cleaning weapons, standing watch, drilling in the mud, was interspersed with moments of panic. It was not a glorious war. There were no medals, just the daily hope that tomorrow's shift would end without blood. And yet somehow, this awkward militia of exhausted settlers held the line. Unresolved thought. As the Jamestown militia grew more structured, more ruthless, and more attuned to its environment, what did it lose in return? Could the very habits that ensured their survival also be laying the groundwork for a deeper cycle of violence on the continent? By the end of the First Anglo-Powhatan War in 1614, the settlement at Jamestown had stabilized, though not through diplomacy or success, but through exhaustion. The conflict had sapped both sides. Casualties mounted, food grew scarce, and both English settlers and the Powhatan people began seeking a fragile pause. This period, which came to be known as the Peace of Pocahontas, marked the end of open warfare and the beginning of something quieter but no less significant. The Jamestown militia, such as it was, had endured. It had grown from a ragtag assembly of frightened men with damp muskets into a semi-permanent force of adaptable colonial fighters. They did not march in bright uniforms, nor carry gleaming weapons. Their boots were caked with swamp mud. Their leather jerkins were stained with smoke and rust, but they were survivors. And what they had learned would echo far beyond the banks of the James River. An unlikely peace and an uneasy transformation. The marriage of Pocahontas to John Rolfe in 1614 was not simply a romantic story, it was a political maneuver. Rolfe, a tobacco planter, had found a strain of the crop that grew well in Virginia soil and appealed to English markets. Pocahontas, as the daughter of Powhatan, offered a living symbol of peace and connection. For a time, hostilities ceased. The militia's muskets were shouldered less often. Training drills were scaled back, but never entirely. Powder was still rationed. Watches still posted. The settlers had learned too well that peace was temporary and the forest still held dangers beyond any treaty. Meanwhile, the English colony began to transform. More settlers arrived, plantations expanded, tobacco profits grew, and the demands of defense changed. Instead of a single centralized militia at Jamestown, each outlying plantation began organizing its own local force. These were often made up of the laborers who worked the land, indentured servants, freedmen, and later, enslaved Africans who were sometimes conscripted in informal ways. It was in this context that the idea of the local militia first took root. Small, decentralized, and self-trained, these groups began forming the defense structure of what would later become Virginia's colonial counties. The English had imported not just weapons, but a system. The birth of a military culture. By the 1620s, Jamestown's militia had become more than a response to danger. It had become a cultural norm. Boys as young as 12 were expected to learn musket drill. Sundays included not only church services, but mandatory musters, roll calls, and training exercises in the open field near the fort. Each landholder was required by law to maintain arms and powder, even if he had no military experience. Punishments for failing to appear at muster included fines, public shamming, or seizure of property. The militia had become the mechanism through which the colony enforced order not just against external threats, but internal ones. Rebellions among servants, disputes between plantations, even pirate raids on the coast. Over time, the weapons themselves evolved. Matchlocks gave way to wheel locks, and then to flintlocks lighter, faster, and more reliable in wet conditions. Powder supplies stabilized as transatlantic trade became more regular. Bayonets began to appear, turning the musket into a close combat weapon. But the ethos remained the same. This was not an army. This was a people prepared, however begrudgingly, to fight. A memory etched in wood and smoke. And what of the forest? It still stood, vast and unknowable, beyond the cleared fields. For all their efforts, the English never fully conquered the land. They adapted to it, learned to live with its rules, adopted its strategies, but it remained in many ways the silent battlefield of their earliest transformation. The forest had taught them ambush. It had taught them silence. It had taught them that the musket was not a symbol of power, but a fragile tool only as effective as the hand and the mind that wielded it. Perhaps most importantly, the forest had stripped away the romanticism of war. The settlers of Jamestown did not write poems about glory or banners. They recorded deaths in crude ledgers. They buried friends quietly in shallow graves. They learned that defense was not about pride, but persistence. And in that persistence was the seed of something new. Legacy and long shadows. The Jamestown militia, amateurish, chaotic, undersupplied nonetheless, shaped the blueprint of American military tradition. Civilian soldier identity. The idea that regular people, not professional soldiers, should defend their community. Local control. Militia units answered to local leaders, not distant governors or kings. This would later fuel the American Revolution. Adaptability. A culture of learning and improvisation in the face of overwhelming odds. But there were darker legacies too. The tactics adopted during the wars with the Powhatan scorched earth, total warfare, targeting of villages would resurface time and again. In the Pequot War, in King Philip's War, in the Seminole conflicts, the normalization of brutality in frontier defense blurred the line between survival and cruelty. And as the militia system formalized, it would eventually become a tool of enforcement, not just defense. Enforcing laws, enforcing slavery, enforcing hierarchy. Weapons, but also walls. In the end, the story of Jamestown's militia is not about guns or armor, but about people building walls, literal and metaphorical. They built walls against the forest, against starvation, against those they feared, but every wall changed them. When the English settlers first arrived, they believed they were bringing civilization to a wild place. But the irony is plain. It was the wilderness that civilized them on its own terms. By the time reinforcements from England arrived in 1614, the men of Jamestown were not the same men who had landed in 1607. Their weapons were soot-stained, their eyes harder, their drills sharper, but their innocence, if it had ever existed, was long gone. Final reflection. What then do we inherit from Jamestown's forgotten militia? A tradition of ordinary people standing ready to defend their homes, or the beginning of a long struggle between control and chaos on a continent defined by both? And in a modern world where armies are professional and weapons digital, do we still carry echoes of those sleepless men on watch in the Virginia swamp, flint in hand, eyes on the dark tree line? Story 2: Stone Walls and Flintlocks, the Pequot War Tactics. In the early 17th century, the dense woodlands of New England were not quiet. They were filled with voices: Pequot, Mohegan, Narragansett, English, Dutch, each speaking in different tongues, each pursuing their own vision of the future. The Pequot, in particular, had risen to dominance in what is now southeastern Connecticut, controlling trade routes, imposing tribute, and navigating an increasingly complex network of European and native alliances. But in 1636, all of that would begin to collapse, and with it, something new would begin to form, a way of fighting that foreshadowed the wars to come. The Pequot War would not be a large war by modern standards. Fewer than 1,000 combatants participated at its height, but the tactics used, the choices made in swamp and forest, reverberated for centuries. This was not just a battle over territory. It was a lesson in the mechanics of colonial violence, a brutal education in walls, firearms, and the strange choreography of ambush and siege. The Pequot: power through control, not conquest. By the 1630s, the Pequot people had become the dominant economic and political force in southeastern New England. Their power did not come from massive armies or permanent fortifications, but through strategic alliances, selective raids, and control over the wampum trade. Wampum beads made from shells was more than ornament. It was currency, tribute, and political messaging all at once. The Pequots managed who could trade, with whom, and on what terms. This allowed them to extract tribute from neighboring groups and secure valuable alliances with Dutch traders along the coast. They did not seek open war with the English settlers of Massachusetts Bay and Connecticut, but they expected to be treated as a peer nation. The English, however, saw them differently. To the Puritans of New England, native political organization was opaque, and native power, when visible, was unnerving. The Pequots were not passive. They resisted English expansion. They pushed back on unfair trade, and they sought to maintain their own diplomatic order. This alone was enough to be seen as a threat. Murder, misunderstanding, and mobilization. In 1636, a Massachusetts trader named John Oldham was found dead, his body mutilated, and his ship looted near Block Island. The English, without definitive evidence, blamed the Narragansett, and later linked the Pequots to the act through vague and often contradictory testimonies. A punitive expedition was organized. Led by John Endicott, the English force attacked coastal villages, burned homes, and killed indiscriminately. Rather than serve as a warning, this sparked further hostilities. The Pequot, now cornered, began attacking English settlements along the Connecticut River in reprisal. For the English colonists, this confirmed their fears. They began mobilizing militias, small units of farmers, blacksmiths, and young men barely trained in combat. They gathered matchlocks, powder horns, and what armor remained from the older European stockpiles. Unlike Jamestown, New England's militias were already more structured. The Puritan communities had, from their founding, emphasized communal defense. Regular musters and drills were held in town commons, and most adult men were expected to serve when called. Still, they were ill-prepared for what came next. Walls in the wilderness. One of the most fascinating and often overlooked aspects of the Pequot War was the way both sides used fortification. The Pequots, like many eastern woodlands peoples, constructed palisaded villages, wooden walls made of sharpened logs driven into the ground, forming a defensive ring. Inside these walls were homes, food stores, and families. The walls were not just military, they were cultural. They marked territory. They organized space. They symbolized identity. But in 1637, these walls would become tombs. On the English side, fortification took a different form. Towns were organized around central meeting houses, which also functioned as strongpoints. Defensive watch routines were set. Outlying farms were sometimes abandoned or fortified with small stockades. Still, this war was fought less over traditional territory and more as a war of annihilation. The English had begun to see the Pequots not as a political rival, but as a problem to be removed. The tactics began to shift. The turning point came in May of 1637, when English forces, led by Captain John Mason and accompanied by Narragansett and Mohegan allies, launched a surprise assault on a large Pequot fort at Mystic. The fort, built on a hill and surrounded by palisades, housed not just warriors but women, children, and elders. The English approach was calculated. Mason's force waited until dawn, crept close to the fort, and then launched an attack from two sides. Unable to breach the palisade easily, they set it on fire. What followed was slaughter. Trapped between burning walls and musket fire, hundreds of Pequots were killed. Few escaped. Most were burned alive or shot as they tried to flee. The Narragansett, shocked at the brutality, later claimed they had expected a traditional fight, not a massacre. For the English, it was seen as a necessary and providential act. Mason would later write, "It may be demanded, why should you be so furious? Should not Christians have more mercy and compassion?" His answer was chilling. Sometimes the scriptures declare women and children must perish with their parents. Flintlock versus fire. At the time of the Pequot War, matchlocks were still in wide use, but the flintlock was beginning to appear in the hands of wealthier or better-connected colonial militias. Flintlocks, unlike matchlocks, did not require a burning cord. They used a piece of flint striking steel to generate sparks, making them faster, more reliable, and more adaptable to forest warfare. In practice, though, the difference in weapon wasn't as important as how the English used them. Rather than engage in stand-up battles, English militias adopted ambush tactics. They coordinated with native allies to track and locate fleeing Pequot bands. They used terrain to their advantage, and they learned to combine firearms with fire itself, not just to destroy villages, but to trap and kill those within. The war became not just a contest of weapons, but of strategies. The English, with fewer numbers but more destructive tools, relied on overwhelming force at specific points. The Pequots, encircled and betrayed by former allies, found themselves running out of room. After Mystic, collapse and resistance. After the massacre at Mystic, the war unraveled quickly. Surviving Pequot groups fled west, some seeking refuge with other tribes. Others were hunted down over the following months. In one final confrontation at a swamp near present-day Fairfield, the remaining fighters were killed or captured. In the aftermath, the English passed laws forbidding the use of the name Pequot. Survivors were sold into slavery or adopted into other tribes. It was, in effect, an attempt at erasure. The English militias, once formed for local defense, had now participated in an offensive war of extermination, and they had learned just how effective sudden violence, surprise raids, and alliances with native factions could be. Unresolved thought. After Mystic, something fundamental had changed, not just for the Pequots, but for the English colonists themselves. What happens when a civilian militia discovers the power of organized destruction and learns that fire can conquer even the most ancient of walls. By mid-1637, New England's fledgling colonies had experienced something unprecedented: victory in war not by defense or negotiation, but through offensive annihilation. The massacre at Mystic had stunned even the English settlers who had carried it out. For many, it was the first time they had participated in mass violence. For others, it was evidence of divine favor. But victory brought more than safety. It brought confidence, and with confidence came replication. What followed in the months after Mystic was not a conventional military campaign, but a systematic hunting of people fleeing survivors of a broken nation. The Pequot War, while brief, set a precedent that shaped the psychology of New England's militias for generations. When outnumbered, strike first. When afraid, strike harder. When surrounded, burn it all. The disappearance of the Pequot. The war did not end at Mystic. Hundreds of Pequot survivors fled westward, pursued by English forces and their native allies. Some sought shelter among the Mohawk. Others were captured by the Mohegans and Narragansett's traditional enemies who had now aligned with the colonists. A final decisive engagement occurred in July 1637 at a swamp near present-day Fairfield, Connecticut. There, a remnant Pequot group made a final stand. Again, the English tactic was not negotiation or siege, it was entrapment. Captain John Mason and Captain Israel Stoughton led the charge. Surrounded in the swamp, the Pequots fought bitterly, but they were outgunned, outnumbered, and betrayed. Many were killed on the spot. Others, including women and children, were captured. Those captured were either executed, enslaved by the English, or distributed as property to native allies. Others were sent to the West Indies in exchange for sugar and molasses, a quiet beginning to New England's eventual entanglement with transatlantic slavery. The name Pequot was outlawed by colonial edict. Speaking the language was discouraged. It was an attempt not just to defeat a people, but to erase them from collective memory. And yet memory lingered. How the war changed the English militias. Before the Pequot War, New England militias were largely symbolic. They gathered for training in town commons. They wore mismatched armor, fired antique muskets, and imagined they might someday defend their homes. The Mystic campaign changed that. Now, these farmers and preachers had tasted coordinated warfare. They had killed with purpose. They had burned palisades, looted bodies, and written about it as though it were God's will. They were no longer amateurs. They were practitioners of colonial counterinsurgency. From this point on, militia service was no longer just a civic responsibility, it was a rite of passage. Training exercises began incorporating skirmish drills and ambush tactics. Weapons inspections were formalized. Ammunition was stored in guarded powder houses. Men were expected to keep their flintlocks clean, loaded and ready not for defense, but for offense. The idea that a militia might be called upon to strike first had entered the colonial imagination. The rise of fortified settlements. Following the war, English towns along the frontier began modifying their designs. Fortification was no longer limited to meeting houses and central squares. Instead, entire towns began to surround themselves with palisades, build garrison houses, homes reinforced with stone or thick timber, where families could retreat during an attack, construct watchtowers at the edge of settlements, establish rotating night watches, often manned by teenagers or older men no longer fit for field service. Some towns, like Wethersfield and Windsor, began organizing their own local militias, independent of larger colonial forces. Each town trained separately, stockpiled ammunition, and maintained internal command structures. They were no longer communities with defenses, they were defensive communities. This hyperlocal militarization would have long-term effects. When future conflicts came, King Philip's War, the French and Indian War, The American Revolution, it was these town militias that formed the backbone of colonial resistance. Warfare by example, the copycat effect. What the settlers learned at Mystic was not forgotten. The war became a model. When later conflicts arose with other native groups, colonists invoked the Pequot War to justify preemptive strikes, massacres, and total war. The idea that native peoples could be negotiated with or even coexisted with was increasingly challenged by a generation of colonial leaders who had learned their warcraft from extermination. Some settlers, such as Increase Mather and William Bradford, later wrote accounts of the war that framed it as a moral necessity, divine retribution upon heathens. Others, more quietly, expressed discomfort. The Narragansett, for instance, were horrified by the English tactics at Mystic and became more cautious in future alliances. But the precedent was set. Even the tools of war changed. Flintlock firearms became more common. Colonists began demanding more efficient weapons from England. Trade networks prioritized powder and shot. New England was arming not just for survival but for strategic advantage. The native countertactics. It would be a mistake to view the native combatants as simply victims. The Pequot and their contemporaries were not passive. They were tactically sophisticated and adapted quickly to European warfare. In fact, many native warriors became expert musketeers. They learned how to use forests and swamps for cover and ambush, fire from concealment and withdraw before counterattack, target officers and supply lines, use decoy fires and misleading trails to confuse pursuit. During and after the Pequot War, tribes like the Mohegans and Narragansetts began acquiring European weapons and integrating them into traditional warfare styles. This fusion of indigenous tactics and European firepower would explode decades later in King Philip's War, a much larger and bloodier conflict. But the seeds were here, sown in the aftermath of Mystic. Warfare as a state function. Perhaps the most lasting consequence of the Pequot War was political. New England's colonies began formalizing cooperation. The New England Confederation, formed in 1643, was an early attempt at colonial unity created explicitly for mutual defense. The war had proven that conflict with native nations was not occasional, it was structural, and if English colonies were to survive, they would need to act in concert. Militias were given broader legal authority. Colonial governments levied taxes to fund arms and munitions. A political infrastructure for perpetual preparedness began to take hold. Warfare, once thought of as a temporary condition, became a permanent feature of colonial life. Unresolved thought. If the English settlers believed they were bringing civilization to the New World, why was their survival secured through tactics that resembled the very savagery they claimed to oppose? And did they realize, as they built walls and trained their sons to shoot, that they were becoming something new and something irreversible? By the end of 1637, the Pequot people had been driven from their land, hunted, captured, killed, or sold into slavery. The colonial militias of New England farmers, ministers, blacksmiths, and boys had not merely defended their homes. They had participated in what was, by modern definition, a campaign of genocide. But this story is not just about moral reckoning. It is about transformation. The Pequot War became the first clear instance of how violence, once learned and systematized, becomes infrastructure. It marked a shift in how war would be imagined in colonial America, not as a tragic necessity, but as a reproducible process. And what's more, it left behind more than just ashes. It left behind methods, maps, walls, and a new kind of soldier. One shaped not in formal European ranks, but in the damp woods of Connecticut, musket in hand, flintlock dry, eye on the tree line. Aftermath in silence. In the months following the war, silence fell on the lands once controlled by the Pequot. Their villages were razed. Survivors were renamed, reclassified, or made invisible. English settlers rapidly moved into the cleared territory, building homesteads and establishing new towns like New London and Stonington. But in that silence, new questions emerged, questions that no sermons or proclamations could easily answer. The Narragansett, former allies of the English, grew uneasy. They had fought to weaken the Pequot, but they had not expected extermination. They realized too late that their own position was now more precarious. The Mohegans, who had benefited most from the alliance, found themselves increasingly dependent on English goodwill. Their warriors had helped win the war, but now their autonomy was conditional. And the English, they began to document the war not as a military operation, but as a spiritual triumph. The birth of the justified war. In sermons and letters, the Pequot War was framed as an act of divine judgment. Ministers preached that the destruction of the Pequot fort at Mystic had been willed by God. Captain John Mason himself wrote, years later, that God laughed his enemies to scorn, making them as a fiery oven. This fusion of military violence with religious certainty became a potent ideological tool. It allowed ordinary men who had never seen battle before to justify the burning of women and children as righteous duty. It made violence moral, and that belief would carry through every major conflict that followed. When King Philip's War broke out decades later, colonial leaders cited the Pequot War as precedent. When American settlers pushed westward in the 18th and 19th centuries, Mystic was remembered not as a tragedy, but as a template, a blueprint of how to fight and win in the New World. Militia evolves. By the 1640s, the English colonies had adopted more formal militia systems, incorporating lessons from the Pequot War. Every able-bodied man was required to own a firearm, powder, and a certain number of bullets. Monthly musters became standard in most towns. Training days were held to teach tactics, formations, and target practice. Stockpiles of ammunition were distributed among regional strongholds. Scouting previously, an informal task was assigned to designated men who knew the forests and river paths. More importantly, the militia began to think strategically. Colonial leaders began compiling intelligence reports, drawing maps of likely attack routes, and cataloging the defensive strengths of different tribal groups. In short, a military culture had taken root not in the form of a standing army, but as a network of trained civilians, always ready, always watching. This civilian-military hybrid became the defining military institution of colonial America, and its first great proving ground had been a burning palisade in Connecticut. Tactical innovations that endured. Though small in scale, the Pequot War introduced tactical elements that became staples of later frontier warfare. Surprise assaults at dawn, used to devastating effect at Mystic, and later in countless raids on both sides. Fire as a weapon not just for destruction, but as a tool to flush out, trap, and demoralize. Use of native allies for intelligence, leveraged by colonial commanders to navigate unfamiliar terrain. Encirclement and enclosure, surrounding enemy camps with musket fire and barriers to prevent escape. Scorched earth tactics, destruction of crops, food stores, and winter shelter to weaken enemy resolve. These weren't accidental developments. They were learned responses, taught by necessity, refined through practice. They also blurred the line between combatant and civilian. The targeting of non-combatants justified as total war would become tragically common. The irony of walls. The title of this story, Stone Walls and Flintlocks, suggests fortification, security, and strength. But there's irony in it. The Pequot Palisade at Mystic, meant to protect, became a trap. The English garrison houses, designed for defense, trained generations of men to live in fear. The walls, both physical and psychological, cut off the possibility of peace as effectively as they kept out enemies. As New England's towns grew stronger, they grew more isolated. Every unknown figure became a threat, every unannounced visitor a potential attacker. Suspicion hardened into policy. This deepening militarization of everyday life would eventually shape colonial attitudes not just toward native nations, but toward governments, neighbors, and even empires. The fear learned in the forests of Connecticut echoed forward into conflicts with France, with Britain, and eventually with each other. The Pequot endure. Despite colonial efforts to erase them, the Pequot people did not disappear. Some integrated into other native communities. Others survived in secrecy, preserving traditions under different names. Over time, descendants regrouped and reclaimed their history. Today, the Mashantucket Pequot and Eastern Pequot tribal nations are federally recognized tribes in Connecticut. They remember Mystic, not as the end but as a transformation. For the English, however, the war would be remembered differently, as the first success, the first time the militia model had worked. It was a dark kind of lesson, but it became the lesson nonetheless. Final reflection. The Pequot War is often forgotten, overshadowed by larger, later conflicts. But it was the war that taught the English colonists how to fight on this continent not as Europeans, but as something new. If war is a teacher, then what exactly did America learn when it looked into the flames of Mystic Fort and called it victory? Story 3. Moccasins and Muskets. The Iroquois rise as military diplomats. Before the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, before the British Empire ruled the coast, and long before the American frontier reached the Mississippi, there was a power that governed through balance, not borders. A force that understood alliances better than armies and trade routes better than treaties. They called themselves the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse. The French called them the Iroquois, and between the late 1500s and mid-1700s, they built one of the most effective diplomatic and military systems in the history of the continent, not through conquest alone, but through a web of politics, trade, kinship, and calculated violence. This is not a story of walls or muskets alone. It is a story of moccasins worn on long journeys between nations, a story of negotiations held at council fires, and ambushes planned in the hushed green of northeastern forests. It is a story of how the Iroquois Confederacy became an indispensable third power between empires, and how their subtle mastery of war and diplomacy changed the fate of North America. The Longhouse Confederacy. The Iroquois Confederacy was, at its core, a political innovation. Composed originally of 5 nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, with the Tuscarora joining later. The Confederacy was founded on the principles of shared governance, clan law, and mutual defense. It was, in effect, a federation long before that concept became familiar in Europe. Each nation retained its autonomy, but agreed to a great law of peace, a complex oral constitution that emphasized consensus, collective decision-making, and long-term stability. The metaphor was clear. They lived together in one longhouse, each nation like a family sharing a single roof, with the fire of council always burning at the center. But peace did not mean passivity. From the early 1600s onward, the Haudenosaunee began to expand their influence through war, not as a colonial power in the European sense, but as a regional balancer. Their goal was not territory, it was survival, control of trade, and security through leverage. Beaver Wars, the fur trade and firearms. The arrival of Europeans brought new opportunities and new threats. The Dutch, and later the English, introduced guns, metal tools, and most importantly, demand. Demand for beaver pelts, which could be processed into felt for fashionable European hats. The Haudenosaunee, whose own territory was becoming trapped between French-backed Algonquian groups and the encroaching Dutch, needed leverage. And so, they moved decisively. Between roughly 1628 and 1701, the Iroquois launched a series of campaigns historians now call the Beaver Wars. Their objective was not to colonize land, but to dominate the fur trade by accessing beaverage hunting grounds and controlling key river routes. They attacked rival tribes Huron, Erie, Susquehannock, and others, often displacing entire populations. But they also adopted captives, integrating survivors into their own society. This system, known as mourning war, aimed to replace lost community members, not just inflict damage. Captives were not always enslaved, many were fully adopted into clans. This form of warfare combined population strategy with resource acquisition. It was deeply personal, but also profoundly calculated. And it was backed by new tools, muskets. The adoption of firearms. The Iroquois were among the earliest native groups to fully embrace firearms. Thanks to trade with the Dutch at Fort Orange, modern-day Albany, they acquired flintlock muskets, powder, and lead shot by the 1640s. But they did not simply mimic European tactics, they adapted. Iroquois war parties continued to use forest cover, stealth, and ambush, but now they integrated firearms into these tactics. A well-trained Iroquois scout could fire from behind a tree and disappear before the echo faded. They avoided open-field battles, understanding that muskets were slow to reload and ineffective beyond a certain range. Instead, they targeted supply lines, ambushed forts, and struck during winter when enemies were least prepared. This blend of mobility, tradition, and technology made them formidable. And it taught the English and French an uncomfortable lesson. Native warriors, properly equipped, could match and surpass European forces in their own terrain. The diplomacy of power. Military strength alone did not make the Iroquois central to colonial power dynamics. It was their diplomatic genius that made them indispensable. They practiced what scholars now call the middle ground strategy, positioning themselves between the English to the east, the French to the north, and a network of native nations to the west and south. Rather than choose a side, they played both. They signed treaties with the English and then negotiated with the French. They extracted trade concessions, promised neutrality, and shifted allegiances when it suited their strategic needs. One of the most famous examples was the Covenant chain, a series of diplomatic agreements between the Iroquois and English colonial governments, particularly New York. These agreements were often renewed at large public ceremonies, where speeches were given, wampum exchanged, and the chain, metaphorically polished to reflect continued alliance. But to the Iroquois, these agreements were not contracts in the European sense. They were relationships, bound by reciprocity and renegotiation. If the English failed to uphold their end, whether through dishonest trade, encroachment, or betrayal, the chain could be tarnished or broken. This layered approach, simultaneously speaking with French, English, and native nations, allowed the Iroquois to maintain independence long after other native powers had collapsed. The moccasin and the message. Iroquois diplomacy was also physical. Delegations traveled by foot, canoe, and sled for weeks to reach colonial capitals or distant villages. A typical diplomatic party might include a speaker fluent in colonial languages, a wampum keeper carrying belts to record agreements, clan representatives ensuring any promises reflected internal consensus, warriors for protection and symbolic strength. They brought gifts, pelts, pipes, carved wooden bowls, and expected gifts in return. Hospitality was essential. Talks might last days. Speeches were given in stylized language, referencing past agreements, shared history, and mutual obligations. The act of traveling to negotiate was itself a political message. It signaled seriousness. It demanded respect. And so the Iroquois moved through forests, rivers, and snow wearing moccasins, carrying muskets, and speaking with the authority of a nation that had learned the value of both fire and words. Unresolved thought. If the Iroquois managed to stand between empires without becoming a colony themselves, what balance were they maintaining, and how long could they walk that thin path before the world around them forced a decision? By the early 1700s, the Iroquois Confederacy stood at a precarious peak, powerful, yet encircled. The French in New France and the English in New York each sought their favor, but feared their independence. The Iroquois, in turn, mastered the delicate act of keeping both sides slightly uncomfortable and slightly indebted. This was a period not defined by outright war, but by constant negotiation, tactical neutrality, and carefully chosen moments of violence. It was a balancing act as intricate as any military campaign, and it required just as much planning. The moccasins still moved across rivers, up mountains, through snow and into courthouses. And while the muskets were sometimes at rest, they were never far from reach. The Great Peace and a Tactical Pause. In 1701, the Iroquois signed the Great Peace of Montreal, formally ending decades of warfare with a coalition of Western native groups backed by the French, including the Huron, Algonquin, and Ojibwe. This agreement allowed them to shift their strategy from expansion to consolidation. The Confederacy promised not to attack France's native allies, and in return, they gained safe access to northern trade routes and freedom of movement across large parts of the interior. For the Iroquois, this was a strategic win. It allowed them to refocus on internal unity and clan politics, maintain favorable trade relationships with both French and English posts, continue playing each empire against the other without committing to full alliance. To the French, the treaty was a diplomatic success, but they misunderstood its depth. The Iroquois had not surrendered. They had deliberately paused. Neutrality as a weapon. During Queen Anne's War, 1702-1713, part of the wider War of the Spanish Succession, French and English forces clashed throughout North America. The Iroquois, despite intense pressure from both sides, refused to fully commit. They allowed English troops to pass through their lands but did not join their campaigns. They held councils with the French but did not share intelligence. They kept trade flowing with both sides. To colonial commanders, this was frustrating. To the Iroquois, it was survival. Their neutrality was not passive, it was tactical. Neutrality maintained their economic leverage, prevented retaliatory raids from either side, forced both empires to continue courting them with gifts, favors, and territorial concessions. This strategy, unique on the continent at the time, was effective precisely because it mimicked power. To be feared for what you might do is sometimes more valuable than doing it. The diplomacy of space. The Iroquois Confederacy understood that geography was power. Their central location between the St. Lawrence River to the north and the Hudson River to the east, with access to the Ohio Valley to the west, gave them a unique advantage. But they also actively shaped geography through diplomacy. They created buffer zones by relocating adopted or allied tribes into key areas. Some of these included the Wyandot in parts of modern Ohio, the Shawnee and Lenape, Delaware, pushed into central Pennsylvania, the Tuscarora, who migrated from the south and were welcomed as the Confederacy's sixth nation around 1722. These relocations were not arbitrary. They served strategic purposes, creating layers of defense between the Iroquois heartland and colonial settlers, expanding influence without direct warfare, using client nations to test alliances and gather intelligence. The Confederacy also developed what historians later called the Iroquois Empire, a loose but effective system of influence over dozens of other tribes, not through conquest, but through adoption, diplomacy, and mediation. The role of the Pine Tree Chiefs. The Haudenosaunee political system was unusually resilient because it was flexible at its core. While hereditary clan leaders, or Roiner, held formal power in the Grand Council, there was also a role for non-hereditary leaders known as pine tree chiefs. These individuals rose through merit, usually men who had demonstrated wisdom, military success, or diplomatic skill. They could speak in council, advise on matters of war and peace, and sometimes represent the Confederacy abroad. Pine tree chiefs acted as diplomatic specialists, often chosen to speak with colonial leaders or travel to distant native nations. They could move between worlds, adapting to the rituals of European diplomacy without abandoning the values of the Longhouse. This hybrid political structure allowed the Iroquois to absorb new ideas and leaders without destabilizing their core governance. It also ensured that every alliance, every treaty, and every message carried the voice of consensus, not just individual ambition. Guns, gifts, and the economy of power. The fur trade remained central to Iroquois power, but so did gifts, the literal, material expressions of diplomatic health. Colonial officials learned that to maintain peace with the Confederacy, they had to send goods regularly: powder, guns, tools, cloth, kettles, rum, beads, and more. These gifts were not bribes. They were obligations, material acknowledgments of mutual responsibility. Failure to deliver appropriate gifts was seen as neglect or insult, and could result in diplomatic cooling or worse, violence. This created an unusual dynamic. The Iroquois were often better armed than many colonial militias. They maintained large stocks of flintlocks, shot, and powder. They trained young men in both native and European styles of combat, and they continued to practice traditional warfare ambushes, forest movement, and small unit tactics that made them devastating in skirmishes. The colonial militias, despite having larger numbers, often feared engaging Iroquois warriors without significant reinforcements. Tensions beneath the balance. But the balance was not eternal. By the 1740s, new pressures were building. Colonial populations were increasing, pushing westward into Iroquois-buffered lands. The French were fortifying the Ohio Valley, threatening Iroquois influence there. Younger warriors were growing impatient with neutrality, eager for prestige in battle. Some client tribes began questioning the Confederacy's ability to protect them. At the same time, British traders were becoming less generous with gifts. French emissaries were offering new alliances, and the Grand Council faced increasing difficulty maintaining internal consensus across all 6 nations. Still, the Iroquois walked the path. They continued to travel in moccasins, muskets slung over shoulders, carrying wampum belts and questions. But the path was narrowing. Unresolved thought. If power lies in standing between 2 great forces, what happens when those forces grow too large to balance? Can even the most skilled diplomats maintain neutrality when the empires around them begin preparing for a final reckoning? By the mid-18th century, the world the Iroquois Confederacy had so carefully balanced was beginning to split apart. The old strategy of diplomacy between empires, of neutral space kept alive by gifts and negotiation, was showing cracks. It had worked for over a century, making the Haudenosaunee one of the most enduring native powers in North America. But now, the terrain of power was shifting beneath their feet. The moccasins still walked the forest paths. The muskets still hung ready on longhouse walls. But the old tactics of balance and silence would soon face a challenge even the Iroquois could not walk around: imperial war without limits. The French and Indian War, no room left to stand between. In 1754, skirmishes in the Ohio Valley exploded into what became known in America as the French and Indian War, but globally as the 7 Years' War. This was no longer just a colonial rivalry. It was a world war, and it left no room for neutrality. The British and French empires both demanded Iroquois loyalty. The French had long-standing relationships with many native nations in the west and north. The British had commercial and treaty ties with the Iroquois through the covenant chain. At first, the Iroquois attempted to hold their usual position: cautious observation, strategic distance, selective involvement. But the balance collapsed quickly. French forces began fortifying Iroquois-claimed lands. British colonial militias demanded access and allegiance. Rival native nations chose sides, dragging the Iroquois into broader tribal politics. Faced with pressure on all fronts, the Grand Council began to fracture. Some nations, like the Mohawk, leaned toward the British. Others hesitated. The internal consensus that had sustained the Confederacy for centuries began to erode. By 1756, the Iroquois officially allied with the British, but only weakly. Their warriors joined select expeditions. Their scouts served as guides, but the full power of the Confederacy was never unleashed. And even that restraint was not enough to save them. The diplomats are ignored. One of the most revealing moments came in 1763, after the British victory. With France expelled from Canada, the British no longer needed native allies. They stopped sending traditional gifts. They ignored the nuanced diplomacy of the covenant chain. Colonial land companies began pressing west into Iroquois-claimed territory, especially the Ohio Valley. The Iroquois sent delegations to protest. Wampum belts were offered and refused. Speeches were made and ignored. The middle ground, which they had long controlled, was vanishing. There was no longer a balance between empires. Only British ambition remained. And in response, a pan-native movement rose: Pontiac's War, led by a coalition of tribes across the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley. Though the Iroquois themselves were divided, many of their satellite nations and younger warriors participated in attacks on British forts. It was a last-ditch effort to reassert native autonomy, to bring back the middle path. It failed. Dispossession begins at the treaty table. From 1768 onward, the Iroquois were pushed into a new role, not as equals, but as negotiators for surrender. In the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, 1768, the British compelled Iroquois leaders to cede vast swaths of land in Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and parts of the Ohio Valley. Many of these lands were not even inhabited by the Six Nations, but by their allied or subject tribes. The British wanted a clear title to the land, and the Iroquois, increasingly isolated and diplomatically cornered, sold land to protect what little they still controlled. This marked the beginning of a tragic irony. The very diplomatic machinery that had once sustained their power was now being used to unravel it. Muskets in the Civil War of Empires. When the American Revolution erupted in 1775, the Iroquois faced an impossible choice. The British Crown called on them to uphold their alliance. The American rebels called for neutrality or loyalty. But how could the Confederacy, now fragile and internally divided, maintain a middle path in a civil war? They couldn't. Different nations chose different sides. The Mohawk, led by the powerful and educated Joseph Brant, sided with the British, launching devastating raids on Patriot settlements. The Oneida, influenced by missionaries and proximity to rebel towns, sided with the Americans. Other nations remained neutral or conflicted, torn by clan loyalties and generational change. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, for the first time in centuries, was at war with itself. The Revolution destroyed more than redcoats and cities. It shattered the unity of the Longhouse. The end of the middle path. By 1783, the Treaty of Paris ended the war, but no Iroquois were invited to the negotiations. The British ceded all native territory without consulting a single tribe. For the Iroquois, it was a devastating betrayal. They had fought, died, and negotiated for empires that never truly saw them as equals. Displaced, many fled to Canada. Others remained in increasingly confined reservations. The once vast diplomatic network of moccasins and muskets collapsed under the weight of land hunger and imperial indifference. Legacy, what endured. And yet not all was lost. The Iroquois political system, the Grand Council, the clan mothers, the great law of peace survived. It endures today. The Iroquois Confederacy still exists, operating on its own terms. Its influence helped shape the concept of federalism in the American Constitution, though often without credit. Its traditions of diplomacy, consensus, and resilience continue to inspire native governance across the continent. Their military tactics, stealth, speed, terrain mastery were adopted and adapted by future American forces. Their vision of balance over dominance remains a stark contrast to the imperial policies that replaced it. Final reflection. The Iroquois stood between empires, not with weapons alone, but with wisdom, restraint, and unmatched political vision. When that middle space vanished, it wasn't just a nation that was displaced, it was a philosophy of power built on presence, not possession. What might North America have looked like if the moccasins had kept walking without the need for muskets at all? Story 4. Armor on the Prairie. The forgotten Spanish conquistadors of the Southwest. When most people think of conquistadors, they imagine jungles and golden temples. Hernán Cortés in Mexico, Francisco Pizarro in Peru. But far to the north, beyond the Rio Grande, a different kind of expedition unfolded. One without empires to plunder, one that led not to riches but to drought, dust, and disillusionment. This is the forgotten story of Spanish conquistadors in the American Southwest, a story not of conquest, but of adaptation. It is a story of men in steel armor crossing open plains and burning deserts, of war horses trotting through cactus-lined canyons, of wooden lances clashing not against empires, but against scattered pueblos and nomadic resistance. It is, above all, a story of survival, how European soldiers, forged in Iberian wars, were broken and reshaped by a landscape they could not control. The northward dream, Spain looks beyond Mexico. By the late 1530s, New Spain, what is now Mexico, had been largely conquered. Spanish cities rose where Aztec ones had fallen. Tribute flowed into royal coffers, but rumors soon spread of more wealth farther north. A new golden land, a new empire to conquer. They called it Cibola. This tale reached the ears of Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, a Spanish nobleman and colonial governor. In 1540, he led an expedition north with nearly 1,000 people, cavalrymen, foot soldiers, priests, servants, and native allies, mostly Tlaxcalan warriors, who had helped the Spanish conquer the Aztecs and were now indispensable to their campaigns. They carried armor, crossbows, arquebuses, and early firearm and banners. Some wore steel breastplates and morions open-faced helmets with crests. Others favored padded cotton armor, lighter and better for the heat. They brought pigs, cattle, and pack mules. They imagined they were marching to another Mexico. Instead, they marched into a vast silence, crossing into the unknown. As Coronado's army crossed the northern deserts through what is now Sonora and into modern-day Arizona and New Mexico, they found no golden cities. Instead, they encountered pueblo villages, carefully built adobe communities clinging to rivers in the arid landscape. The architecture amazed them. Multi-story homes, terrace buildings, complex irrigation systems. But there was no gold, no empires, just small, interconnected communities of farmers, herders, and weavers. Some pueblos welcomed the strangers cautiously. Others resisted. Coronado, driven by ambition and the need to justify the expedition, responded with force. One of the earliest major conflicts came at Huaca, a Zuni pueblo in present-day New Mexico. When the villagers resisted Spanish demands, Coronado attacked. His steel-armored cavalry charged adobe walls. Crossbows rained down. The defenders fought back with slings, bows, and stone axes. Despite superior weaponry, the Spanish suffered injuries. Coronado himself was knocked unconscious by a stone. The pueblo was taken, but at great cost. This set the tone for the entire expedition. Each village a disappointment, every promise of wealth a mirage. Armor in the desert. The Spanish armor, designed for battles in temperate Europe, quickly became a liability. The heat of the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts was relentless. Soldiers reported metal breastplates burning their skin. Helmets became ovens. Marching through thorn brush and open plains in full armor was not just exhausting, it was dangerous. Gradually, many abandoned steel for lighter alternatives. Escapiles, quilted cotton armor soaked in brine and dried hard. It could stop arrows and absorb shock while allowing airflow. Leather jerkins, lighter than plate, though offering less protection. Shields of hide or wood, more practical than metal bucklers. Adaptation was key. Those who clung to full steel often collapsed. Those who adjusted survived. Horses, too, struggled. The Spanish warhorse, so fearsome in European battlefields, faced cactus thorns, rocky terrain, and heat stroke. Many died. Others escaped and became the first feral horses of the American Southwest, laying the groundwork for the mustangs that would later define the region. Clash of war cultures. The Spanish viewed warfare as formal, structured formations, honor and glory. But in the Southwest, they faced opponents with very different approaches. The Pueblo peoples avoided open battle. They used the terrain. They fled when overwhelmed, regrouped, and reappeared. They defended behind thick adobe walls. They sent runners to warn neighboring villages. As the expedition pushed east onto the Llano Estacado, the endless plains of Texas and eastern New Mexico, they encountered nomadic groups, possibly early Apache or other Athabascan-speaking peoples. These warriors struck quickly, vanished into the grasslands, and refused to meet the Spanish face to face. The Spanish could not understand this. There were no cities to seize, no kings to capture, only fleeting shadows on the horizon. The cross and the lance. Priests accompanied Coronado, seeking to convert the indigenous peoples. But conversion rarely came easily. The Pueblo religions were deeply rooted in the land, the seasons, and the cycles of water and maize. Missionaries demanded the destruction of kivas, ceremonial spaces, idols, and traditions. Some Pueblos complied to avoid punishment, others resisted quietly. The Spanish imposed themselves with cross and sword. Yet over time, they learned that religion could not be forced without consequences. The seeds of resistance planted here would bloom later in the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, the most successful indigenous uprising in North American history. But in Coronado's time, the priests still believed they could bring salvation by replacing ritual with doctrine. The lances remained ready when sermons failed. Unresolved thought. As Coronado's men trudged deeper into the sun-baked emptiness, abandoning their armor and their hopes of gold, what was left to hold their purpose together? Could an army survive without an enemy worth defeating or a prize worth winning? By the winter of 1541, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado and his weary army had traveled nearly 2,000 miles across the deserts, river valleys, and plains of the American Southwest. Their armor was patched or abandoned, their supplies dwindling, and their expectations of gold, of glory, reduced to dust. Still, they marched on. The land refused to give them what they wanted, but it gave them something else, a lesson in limits. Not just the limits of empire, but the limits of will, endurance, and meaning itself. This second leg of Coronado's journey would take them into lands few Europeans had ever seen. The high plains of the Llano Estacado, the windswept emptiness of the Texas Panhandle, and the vast rolling territory of what is now Kansas. And along the way, they would find not empires but emptiness. or so they thought, into the sea of grass. One of the greatest psychological blows to the expedition came not from a battle, but from geography. In the spring of 1541, Coronado's scouts reported a new terrain ahead: flat, endless, featureless. The Llano Estacado, or staked plains, was unlike anything the Spaniards had known. No mountains, no rivers, no landmarks, just waist-high grasses, open sky, and the wind. Navigation was nearly impossible. Without trees, settlements, or familiar terrain, men lost their sense of distance. Days blurred into each other. Rations ran low. Horses stumbled from exhaustion. Armor had long since been discarded in favor of lighter gear, but even this proved difficult in the prairie sun. One soldier described the experience as walking upon the sky itself, with no place to rest the eye. They were no longer conquistadors, they were wanderers. The mirage of Quivira. Coronado was led north by a native captive named the Turk, who told him of a great city far to the east, Quivira, where gold flowed. The people wore ornaments of silver, and grand buildings pierced the sky. This was not the first time indigenous guides had described fantastical cities. Some historians believe these were intentional misdirections, an effort by Pueblo or plains groups to lure the Spanish away from their homelands. Others suggest the Turk sought to manipulate rivalries or escape his own captivity. Either way, Coronado believed it. Driven by desperation and pride, he took a select group of 30-40 horsemen and headed northeast. They crossed the Canadian River, entered what is now western Oklahoma, and finally reached central Kansas. There, instead of cities, they found grass huts, river farming villages, and a modest agricultural society, likely the ancestors of the Wichita people. The inhabitants were generous and curious, but they had no gold, no silver, no palaces. Just maize, squash, and beans. Coronado had come looking for an empire. He found a community. He had the Turk executed for deception. Violence without victory. The longer the expedition continued, the more erratic its violence became. With no treasure to claim and no powerful enemies to defeat, the Spanish turned to enforcing obedience among the Pueblo communities they had left behind in New Mexico. When reports reached Coronado that the Tex Pueblos had rebelled, killing Spanish soldiers and native allies, he returned with fury. The Tex War followed, a brutal winter campaign of siege and slaughter in the Rio Grande Valley. Spanish forces surrounded villages, starved defenders, and burned survivors alive. But there was no strategic purpose. These were not decisive battles. They were displays of frustration, meant to punish disobedience, not achieve objectives. Even the Spanish chroniclers, often defenders of conquest, described the cruelty with unease. No wealth was taken, no power established, just charred walls, shattered villages, and endless resentment. The return south, empty-handed and forgotten. By 1542, Coronado's expedition was unraveling. Supplies were exhausted. Morale was broken. Men were deserting or dying from illness. With no gold and no empire to justify their mission, they had only one choice: return to Mexico. When they did, they were greeted not as heroes, but as failures. Coronado himself was tried for abuse of power. Though ultimately acquitted, his reputation never recovered. He died in relative obscurity. The expedition, one of the largest exploratory military ventures in early American history, was largely erased from popular memory. No cities had been founded. No wealth returned. No New Spain carved into the prairies. For over 40 years afterward, no major Spanish expedition returned to the American interior. The empire had recoiled. The shadows that remained. And yet Coronado's men had changed the land, even if briefly. Feral horses escaped into the plains, where they began forming the wild herds that would eventually revolutionize native mobility. Spanish names for rivers, mountains and regions remained on maps. The rumor of Spaniards in armor persisted among indigenous nations, some of whom would later prepare differently when new expeditions came. The Pueblo people, traumatized but unbroken, began developing a legacy of resistance, one that would culminate in the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 when indigenous forces would finally drive the Spanish out of the region for over a decade. Even in failure, the expedition planted seeds of transformation for both the Spanish and the people they tried to dominate. Armor as symbol. By the end of the expedition, armor was no longer worn. It was carried, perhaps, or left behind, but it lingered in memory. To the Spanish, it had come to represent false protection, the weight of imperial delusion. To the Pueblo, it represented oppression and fire, something to be feared but also challenged. In oral traditions, the image of a man in steel gleaming, alien, riding a beast remained long after his presence had vanished. And across the plains, where moccasins now followed horse hooves, the land remembered. Final reflection. In the end, Coronado found no city of gold, only the echo of his own ambition in a land too vast to conquer and too silent to praise him. His failure is easy to forget, but perhaps it's the truest kind of story, one where conquest bends not toward glory, but toward humility. What if this quiet end, not victory, was the beginning of a different kind of American history? Story 5, Fort Necessity, Washington's first fight. Before he became a general, before he stood tall at Valley Forge or led a new nation, George Washington was something else entirely. A young, ambitious Virginian with too little experience and too much to prove. In the summer of 1754, at the age of just 22, Washington led a small force into the dense forests of what is now southwestern Pennsylvania. There, in a damp clearing hastily surrounded by logs and mud, he built a tiny circular fort, Fort Necessity. The name, like the place, was more hopeful than it was accurate. He believed he was carrying out a mission of defense, but the truth was more complicated. In reality, Washington had fired the opening shots of a global war, a conflict that would stretch from the Ohio River to the Caribbean, from Europe to the Philippines. The 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War. And it all began, inauspiciously, with a skirmish, a rainstorm, and a poorly made fort in a field no one could truly control. The contest for the Ohio country. By the early 1750s, the British and French were locked in a slow-burning conflict over the Ohio River Valley, a vast, fertile region that both empires claimed but neither fully controlled. The British colonies, especially land-hungry Virginia, believed their charters extended westward into this region. The French, meanwhile, were building a line of forts to protect their fur trade routes stretching from Canada to the Mississippi. Native nations, particularly the Ohio Iroquois, Shawnee, and Delaware, found themselves caught in the middle, courted by both powers, wary of both, seeking to preserve their autonomy. The British created the Ohio Company, a land speculation venture backed by powerful Virginians, including the Washington family. When rumors spread that the French were building forts deep in the contested territory, the Virginia governor decided to act. He turned to George Washington, a land surveyor with some militia experience, but no formal military training. He gave him a mission: deliver a message to the French demanding withdrawal. The first foray, message delivered, warning ignored. In December 1753, Washington trekked hundreds of miles through snow and frozen rivers to reach Fort Le Boeuf, a French outpost near Lake Erie. He delivered his letter, formal, polite, yet firm. The French commander received it cordially and refused to leave. Washington returned to Williamsburg with the reply and found himself promoted. The next spring, he was given a new order: lead a detachment of Virginia militia into the Ohio country and secure British claims. It was a dangerous gamble. The frontier was lightly settled. The French had professional troops and native allies. Washington had a few dozen undisciplined militiamen, many of them teenagers and farmers with old muskets. Still he marched. Jumonville Glen, the spark. In May 1754, while scouting near the present-day site of Uniontown, Pennsylvania, Washington learned that a small French party was camped nearby, possibly to monitor British movements. He attacked. The engagement, known as the Battle of Jumonville Glen, lasted less than 15 minutes. Washington's forces, assisted by native allies led by the Mingo chief Tanacharison, known as the Half-King, killed or captured the French detachment. Among the dead was Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, the French commander. The French would later claim Jumonville was on a diplomatic mission and that Washington had assassinated him. Accounts differ as to what happened next. Some say Jumonville was shot during the skirmish. Others claim he was executed by Tanacharison after surrendering, his skull split with a tomahawk as he knelt in the ferns. Washington claimed it was a fair fight, but history has its doubts. What is clear is that this act ignited war. Fort Necessity, built in panic. After the skirmish, Washington knew retaliation was coming. He fell back to a clearing in the forest and ordered the construction of a fort. It was not a fort in any real sense, more a small circular palisade, barely 50 feet across, with a shallow ditch and wooden walls. It lacked high ground. It lacked shelter. It lacked artillery. It was built in haste and fear, not with confidence. Washington called it Fort Necessity. To his credit, he may have understood how ironic that name truly was. He had around 400 men, including British regulars and colonial militia. Many were ill, poorly armed, and poorly trained. When the French returned, they brought 600 soldiers and Canadian militia, along with several hundred native warriors. They surrounded the fort. The siege, July 3, 1754. Rain poured. The Virginia men huddled inside the fort's low walls, their powder wet, their trenches flooded. The French remained in the tree line, firing steadily from cover. The British returned fire blindly, unable to see their attackers. For 9 hours, the exchange continued. The French could have stormed the fort, but chose instead to harass and exhaust their enemy. Finally, with his men cold, wounded, and demoralized, Washington agreed to surrender the only time in his life he would do so. The French, led by Louis Coulon de Villiers, Jumonville's brother, offered terms. Washington would sign a document acknowledging responsibility for Jumonville's death and agree to withdraw. The surrender document was written in French. Washington did not speak it fluently. He signed it anyway. The aftermath, a global war begins. Back in Virginia, Washington's defeat was downplayed, but in Europe, the incident became a casus belli. France accused Britain of murdering a diplomat. Britain blamed French aggression. By 1756, the conflict had expanded into a full-scale world war. The 7 years. War fought in Europe, Asia, Africa, and across the Americas. It would eventually lead to the fall of New France, the expansion of British control in North America, the massive British debt that triggered new taxes on American colonies, the eventual outbreak of the American Revolution, all from a rain-soaked clearing in Pennsylvania. Unresolved thought. As Washington marched away from Fort Necessity, humiliated and soaked, did he understand what he had done? Did he know that a few dozen shots in the woods had started a war that would redraw the map of the world? In July 1754, George Washington trudged back toward Virginia, having surrendered his first fort and admitted, whether knowingly or not, to the assassination of a French officer. He was 22 years old. His clothes were soaked, his troops demoralized, and his name, now known across European courts, was tied to the spark of a global war. And yet, far from ending his career, This moment became his first real education in the nature of warfare, its politics, its absurdities, and its deeply impersonal hunger. Fort Necessity was not a failure. It was a classroom. The war it ignited, the French and Indian War, as it would be known in British America, would become the proving ground for a generation of colonial soldiers. But for Washington, it was something more personal, a lesson in reputation, resilience, and the hard divide between British regulars and colonial ambition. Back in Virginia, a hero's welcome, sort of. Despite the surrender, Washington returned to Virginia to celebration, not censure. Colonial newspapers praised his bravery. The Ohio Company hailed his courage. Even the Virginia governor treated him as a rising star. Why? Because in the logic of 18th century frontier politics, defiance mattered more than victory. The mere act of standing up to the French in disputed territory had political value. The fact that a colonial officer had drawn blood, even inadvertently, gave Virginia grounds to claim it was defending its land. What was less discussed was the surrender document Washington had signed, written in French and translated poorly for him. One critical phrase had him confessing to the assassination, l'assassinat of Jumonville. Washington later claimed he had not understood the meaning, and some historians believe the interpreter, Jacob Van Braam, mistranslated the term as simply death or killing in battle. But the French took the wording at face value and used it to frame the British as the aggressors in European diplomatic circles. So while Virginia toasted his name, Europe prepared for war. The British Army arrives. Washington's brief moment as commander would be put on hold. By 1755, the British had decided to take matters into their own hands. They sent Major General Edward Braddock, a veteran of European campaigns, to America with a force of 2,000 regular soldiers. Washington, still a provincial officer with no formal military rank, volunteered to serve as Braddock's aide-de-camp. The contrast was immediate. Braddock saw the colonial militias as amateurish and unreliable. He insisted on rigid formations, polished uniforms, and proper European tactics, columns and cannon, cavalry and pageantry. Washington, already hardened by forest fighting, warned him. The Ohio country was not Europe. Braddock dismissed him. The Braddock expedition, another lesson, another defeat. In summer 1755, Braddock marched west to seize Fort Duquesne, the new French stronghold at the forks of the Ohio River, present-day Pittsburgh. The march was slow, trees had to be cut, roads built, supply wagons dragged through swamps. On July 9, 1755, just miles from the fort, the British column was ambushed in the forest by a smaller force of French troops and native warriors, likely including Shawnee, Ottawa, and Canadian militia. The results were catastrophic. British soldiers stood in ranks, easy targets in red coats. Native warriors fired from behind trees and rocks. Officers on horseback were singled out and shot. Chaos spread, horses screamed, cannons got stuck in the mud. Nearly two-thirds of Braddock's force was killed or wounded. Braddock was shot through the lungs. Washington had 2 horses shot out from under him and 4 bullet holes in his coat, but survived. He rallied the retreat, helping to prevent a total massacre. The British regulars never forgot the humiliation. Washington never forgot the lesson. A new kind of soldier. Washington's experiences at Fort Necessity and the Braddock ambush forged his understanding of warfare, not just tactics, but how war felt. The smell of wet powder in the rain. The sound of musket balls cracking tree trunks. The fear of encirclement in terrain you don't understand. The unreliability of supply chains, allies and interpreters. The indifference of imperial policy to local knowledge. He began to understand that European methods had limits in America's forests, and that colonial soldiers, while often ill-equipped and untrained, had a kind of adaptability the British lacked. He also realized that colonial officers were seen as inferior. Even after Fort Necessity, the British Army refused to grant him formal rank. Colonial commissions meant little to the crown. Washington, proud and ambitious, would never forget that. War spreads like water. As these local battles unfolded, the French and Indian War began to spread. Raids along the frontier intensified. Settlers in western Pennsylvania fled. British colonies demanded more troops and resented the cost. French forces built new forts deeper into the interior. The native nations, for their part, played both sides. The Iroquois Confederacy officially claimed neutrality, but allowed British diplomacy. The Delaware and Shawnee, long pressured by British expansion, leaned toward the French. Native warriors became critical to both armies, serving as scouts, ambushers, and shock troops. The Wilderness War was one of raids, reprisals, and shifting alliances. There were no front lines, only villages burned, trails ambushed, and forts surrounded in silence. Fort Necessity remembered. In the years that followed, Fort Necessity faded from maps, but not from memory. For Washington, it remained a personal turning point. In later writings, he referred to it with regret, but never with shame. He saw it as a moment that taught him more than any victory could have. He learned the cost of poor positioning, the danger of underestimating terrain, the need for disciplined retreat, the burden of command even at 22. And perhaps most of all, he learned that British generals did not always know best. Unresolved thought. When Washington stood under the dripping trees at Fort Necessity, signing a surrender he couldn't read, did he begin to see the fault lines in the empire he served? And if so, did the seeds of revolution begin in the mud of that field, long before liberty was even imagined? Years after the rain had ceased and the fort had rotted into the soil, George Washington continued to revisit Fort Necessity, not always aloud, but in writing, in reflection, and in the quiet calculations of a man who never forgot his own inexperience. Though minor in the scope of global war, the events of 1754, the skirmish at Jumonville Glen, the hastily built fort, the defeat in the mud would ripple across continents. It began as a confused frontier conflict, born of overlapping claims and youthful ambition. But it became something more, the prologue to the 7 Years' War, and the prelude to a revolution that would reshape the world. The lesson of Fort Necessity wasn't about tactical blunders alone. It was about how empires crumble when they ignore the voices of the periphery, when their officers are deaf to the land beneath their boots. The global consequences of a local mistake. By 1756, the war that Washington had helped ignite had engulfed the Atlantic world. In Europe, Prussia and Britain fought France, Austria and Russia. In India, British and French trading companies used local armies to contest empires. In the Caribbean, sugar colonies were blockaded, raided, and burned. In Africa, coastal forts changed hands in skirmishes no European remembered. And in North America, British forces launched massive expeditions to drive the French out of Canada. At every strategic meeting, diplomats and generals pointed back to the cause, the killing of Joseph Coulon de Jumonville by Virginia militia. That small engagement gave both sides the pretext they needed to escalate. And all because a 22-year-old surveyor from the Virginia frontier was told to deliver a message. Washington and the colonial military divide. During the war, Washington tried repeatedly to gain a regular commission in the British Army. He believed he had earned it. He had led men under fire. He had ridden through ambushes and delivered reports across dangerous terrain. But the British refused. To them, colonial officers were socially inferior. Their service, however brave, did not warrant royal authority. Their troops were undisciplined, their methods crude. This slight burned in Washington. He returned to Virginia to command militia forces there, but he was never again placed under direct British command. He spent the rest of the war watching regular officers blunder through unfamiliar country, often ignoring the hard-won lessons of men like himself. The colonial troops, for their part, began to see British arrogance not as authority, but as weakness. An emotional divide was opening, a subtle but powerful sense that the colonies were not fully respected, even when they bled for the crown. It was a sentiment that would grow. The frontier's price. While Britain and France fought for empires, native nations bore the brunt of the war. Raids and counter-raids became the norm across Pennsylvania, Virginia, and New York. Native villages were burned. Homesteads were attacked. Alliances shifted constantly as tribes tried to survive amidst two imperial machines grinding toward total war. Fort Necessity had signaled not only the start of international conflict, but the start of a regional unraveling, a breakdown of the delicate balance native nations had long maintained. It became increasingly clear, whoever won, native autonomy would be diminished. And all the while, young men were being taught the language of war in fields they would later claim for themselves. From necessity to revolution. It's easy to draw a straight line from Fort Necessity to the American Revolution, but it was not immediate. It would take 20 years. Yet many of the same men who had fought alongside British officers in the 1750s would later oppose them in the 1770s. Washington, Gates, Putnam, Arnold. They had seen the British Army up close. They had learned its strengths and its arrogance. They had learned how to fight in forests, how to build roads, how to rally troops without orders from London. Perhaps most importantly, they had begun to question why their loyalty was not returned with respect. The revolution did not begin with taxes, it began with familiarity. The fort reappears. For decades, Fort Necessity was forgotten, overgrown, unvisited, unmarked. But in the 20th century, archaeologists uncovered its remains. The site was restored, and today stands as a quiet national monument, not a battlefield in the traditional sense, but a historical crossroads. Visitors come not to marvel at grand tactics or cannon fire, but to reflect on something more modest and perhaps more meaningful. A field too low to defend. A storm that soaked the powder. A young man who signed a paper he couldn't read. And a moment when the world shifted, not with ceremony, but with confusion. What Washington carried. Washington never glorified Fort Necessity. He rarely mentioned it in later life, except with humility. But he never forgot that a commander must understand terrain, that alliances with native nations were complex and fragile, that diplomacy, poorly managed, could ignite catastrophe, that rain ruins powder and youth makes mistakes. These were not lessons from books. They were earned wet, wounded, and weary on the edge of a forest few in London had ever seen. And though he would later lead a nation, his education began with a failure. Final reflection. In the great epics of history, we often look to victories for meaning, but sometimes it is the missteps, the muddy fields, the flawed decisions, the unread documents that shape a leader more than any triumph. If George Washington's greatness had a birthplace, was it not in the pain of that little fort, where necessity outpaced preparation, and the war began before he even knew it? Story 6. Tomahawks and Trade Guns. The Frontier Economy of Violence. By the mid-1700s, the edges of British America were not tidy. Beyond the neat fields of Virginia and the village greens of New England lay the vast frontier, a place where borders blurred, law was inconsistent, and survival was measured not in ideology, but in distance, firepower, and trust. This was not the land of polished armies or grand forts. It was the land of scouts, smugglers, traders, warriors, and farmers with muskets. It was a place where tomahawks hung by doors like lanterns, and where rifles rested on mantles like tools because they were. This was the frontier economy of violence, a system not built on conquest alone, but on the steady exchange of weapons, goods, alliances, and retribution. Here, guns were currency, tomahawks were conversation, and almost every interaction carried the weight of risk. In this world, violence was not simply a tool, it was a language. Guns across the forest. The firearm came early to the American frontier, not as a symbol of military might, but as an object of trade. French, Dutch, and British traders all recognized the power of guns in diplomacy. For native nations, acquiring firearms was not simply about strength, it was about balance. A group with no access to guns could be overrun by those who had them. By the early 1700s, trade guns, especially smoothbore flintlock muskets, were found in nearly every native community from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. These weren't the British Army's Brown Bess or the American Pennsylvania rifle. They were custom-made for trade, lighter, longer, and sometimes ornately decorated to appeal to native tastes. One of the most common models was the Northwest gun, often marked with a serpent or dragon engraved on the side plate. It wasn't rare to see warriors who wore little else beyond deerskin and wore paint carrying guns made in Birmingham or Leech. Firearms were sacred tools used in hunting, defense, and ceremony. Many native groups incorporated gunfire into ritual, mimicry, and intimidation tactics. The gun in this world was both gift and threat. The tomahawk, weapon and warning. Alongside the musket was a tool of more intimate persuasion, the tomahawk. Introduced through European trade, but inspired by pre-contact stone axes, tomahawks were small, single-handed weapons with a steel or iron head and a wooden haft. Some had pipe bowls built into the back, turning the weapon into a smoking pipe used both to parley and to kill. The tomahawk was the sidearm of the frontier. It split kindling and cracked skulls. It carved meat and carved messages. It was carried in belts, swung in ambushes, and placed carefully beside trade blankets. On the frontier, to carry a tomahawk was not suspicious, it was expected. Boys learned to throw them at trees. Men sharpened them before diplomacy, and their use in close quarters gave rise to techniques that mixed European fencing with indigenous grappling and ambush strategies. In the hands of both colonist and native, it was a weapon of proximity and precision, the moment when talk ended and movement mattered. Violence as currency. In much of the 18th century frontier, violence was not merely an outcome of conflict, it was often the basis of negotiation. Scalp bounties were common. Colonial governments, unable to police the backcountry, offered payments for enemy scalps, sometimes specifying whether the scalp came from a man, woman, or child. These were intended as military incentives, but they quickly became economic engines, exploited by rogue militias and opportunists. Raiding became a career, not just a response. A village burned might yield loot, captives, and claims to land. A patrol might return with evidence of enemy killed, redeemable for silver or land grants. Native groups engaged in this system, too, sometimes for revenge, other times as tactical pressure. A well-timed raid could change treaty terms, shift alliances, or provoke colonial governors into concessions. Entire war economies emerged, fueled by trading posts, fur, lead shot, and manufactured powder. Some traders quietly sold arms to both sides of a conflict, justifying it as business, not betrayal. In this world, trust was a luxury, and firepower a necessity. The border settlers' arsenal. Settlers living in isolated cabins or frontier communities were self-reliant by force. A typical homestead might have a smoothbore musket, good for both shot and ball. A hunting rifle, more accurate but slower to reload. several knives and hatchets used daily, but also kept ready. Homemade powder horns, sometimes engraved with maps or verses. A piggin of lead, used to cast bullets over the fire. Barrels of saltpeter, charcoal and sulfur to make or stretch gunpowder. Boys learned to shoot squirrels by age 9. Girls learned to reload. Entire families knew how to retreat to blockhouses, how to use tree lines for cover, how to survive until help came or didn't. And always the tomahawk was near, hung on the doorframe, tied to a belt, thrown in practice, then retrieved in silence. Guns as gifts, guns as control. Colonial officials often used firearms as diplomatic tools. A loyal native leader might receive a musket with silver inlay. A rival group might be denied powder shipments before negotiations. A trader who armed the wrong people might be jailed or quietly promoted. The flow of weapons became a means of influence. The British and French both maintained massive inventories of trade guns, stored at forts and dispensed during treaty councils or to loyal war parties. Some native leaders used gun control as diplomacy, too, demanding regular supplies to maintain alliance, or threatening to go to rival traders if gifts were insufficient. This created an arms race of dependency. And as the 18th century wore on, the sheer number of weapons in circulation transformed the frontier into a place where almost every adult male was armed, regardless of allegiance. There was no such thing as a non-combatant. The powder keg titans. By the 1760s, after the end of the French and Indian War, the British attempted to regulate the flow of weapons. They feared a native uprising. They feared rogue settlers. They feared that the tools they had once used to secure the frontier were now out of their control. And they were right to worry. In 1763, a widespread uprising Pontiac's War swept across the western frontier. British forts fell, traders were killed, colonists fled. The British responded with brutal retribution. It was one of the first major signs that the old frontier order was collapsing. The British tried to restrict settlement beyond the Appalachians. American colonists resented this. The frontier war economy built on guns, raids, and retaliations now turned inward. Violence that once flowed outward toward French or native enemies began pointing back toward government, taxation, and empire. Unresolved thought. When everyone is armed and violence becomes a form of exchange, what happens when the supply chain breaks? If the frontier taught people to trust the gun more than the law, what hope did politics have once the powder ran out? In the official histories of the American colonies, much is made of legislatures, taxes, and town meetings. But on the frontier, governance often came down to who had the guns, who sold the powder, and who was willing to use both. While politicians debated policy in Williamsburg or Philadelphia, a parallel world thrived beyond the mountains, a world held together by trading posts, smokehouses, and unwritten agreements, where the tomahawk was as valid as the contract, and the trade gun was the new coin of the realm. It was a world where violence wasn't a breakdown of the system, it was the system. Trading posts, crossroads of conflict. The most visible symbols of this world were trading posts, scattered across the backcountry like pressure points on a map. Often fortified, sometimes semi-legal, these posts acted as supply centers, intelligence hubs, and diplomatic platforms all in one. A post might serve colonial settlers in need of powder, blankets, and iron tools. Native delegations arriving to trade furs for flintlocks or brandy. Smugglers passing information or contraband between rival factions. Ownership varied. Some were run by colonial governments, others by licensed traders, still others by privateers, men with just enough capital and ruthlessness to operate in gray zones. The inventory was always roughly the same. Powder and lead, musket parts and flints, kettles, cloth, tobacco, and alcohol. And in locked crates the trade guns. The traders knew the risks. They were middlemen, often dealing with both sides of a conflict. A gun sold today might return tomorrow in a rival's hands. Powder traded in good faith might be used in a raid the following week. But the profits were too good, and the alternatives, silence, starvation, isolation, were worse. The mixed economy of frontier arms. The frontier economy blurred lines between legality and survival. While the British government issued official trade licenses, enforcement was nearly impossible. Unlicensed traders traveled through woods and rivers, avoiding inspection. French agents still operated beyond the official end of the 7 Years' War, stirring up resistance. Native traders, both formal and informal, carried guns hundreds of miles to kin and allies. Colonial governments tried to impose order, but the scale and terrain of the backcountry defied bureaucracy. Instead, a kind of unofficial system emerged. Towns turned a blind eye to unregistered arms sales. Officers made deals with rival native groups through informal emissaries. Traders bribed local officials with powder or pelts. Weapons were now a form of diplomacy, exchanged not only in war but in friendship. If a rival village received a case of muskets and you did not, your status slipped. The consequences weren't immediate, but they were inevitable. Guns meant influence, and influence meant survival. Raiding as routine. On the edges of empire, raiding was not war, it was maintenance. Native war parties moved through the forests in small, fast units, no banners, no drums. Their targets were not armies but homesteads, supply wagons, and outposts. Sometimes the goal was retribution. Other times it was supplies. Often it was captive taking to replenish lost kin or to gain leverage in negotiation. Colonial militias responded in kind. Raiding became a cycle, one justified by past raids, real or rumored. The logic of peace collapsed in the face of this arithmetic. For every burned barn, a burned village. For every stolen horse, a dead scout. For every scalp, a bounty. The line between defense and provocation vanished. Militias and freelancers. Colonial militias were often formed at the town level, but their activity on the frontier was irregular. In times of tension, a militia might ride for days, chasing rumors or retaliating for a raid. In times of relative peace, they might quietly trade with the same groups they had fought months before. When militias weren't available, vigilantes and freelancers filled the gap. These men were not bandits, not exactly, but they were not soldiers either. Often veterans of earlier wars, they formed irregular ranger units or operated solo, offering services as scouts, hunters, interpreters, or mercenaries. They carried their own weapons, they knew the trails, and they expected payment if not in coin, then in powder, rum, or land rights. These fighters lived on the edge of legitimacy. Colonial governors sometimes decried their violence, only to employ them secretly weeks later. They knew the language of the woods better than any politician, and they were fluent in its grammar of ambush and survival. Children of the gun. In this world, children grew up with weapons the way others grew up with tools. Boys learned to shoot squirrels from the age of 6 or 7. By 12, they could track a deer, reload a musket, and skin a hide. Girls, too, were trained not always in shooting, but in loading, warning, and hiding during attacks. One Pennsylvania settler's journal recorded that his daughter, aged 10, once stood alone on the roof with a musket, firing blindly into the dark, while her father ran for help. It wasn't valor, it was necessity. These were not soldiers. They were participants in a system that demanded readiness from every member. Powder, pride, and paranoia. By the late 1760s, tensions along the frontier had become almost existential. Native nations feared being swallowed entirely by settler expansion. Settlers feared isolation, attack, or abandonment by distant governments. Colonial officials feared losing control of their own people. And through it all, guns moved quietly from ships to posts, from posts to traders, from traders to villages and back again. Each transfer carried a promise: safety, honor, retaliation, revenge. The guns were not the cause of the violence, but they were its currency, its punctuation, and its prophecy. They foretold a future that no treaty could fully prevent. Unresolved thought. When a world is built around tools of war, how do you build peace without dismantling the very structure of life itself? If every handshake is backed by powder and lead, can trust survive the echo of the next shot? By the eve of the American Revolution, the frontier had already been fighting for generations. In the colonies, pamphlets and speeches decried taxation and representation. But in the backcountry from the Appalachians to the Ohio River, the issues were older and bloodier. There, the cries of liberty rang against a backdrop of gun smoke, scorched cabins, and forest paths littered with musket balls. The economy of violence that had defined the frontier for decades was not dismantled. When the revolution began, it was absorbed into the conflict. The same men who had traded powder under the table or led retaliatory raids after harvest now picked sides. The same families who had buried their children after night attacks now flew banners, some for King George, others for the Continental Congress. And the weapons, they were already in place. The powder alarm. In 1774, a year before the battles of Lexington and Concord, tensions in Massachusetts reached a breaking point when British troops removed gunpowder from a provincial magazine near Boston. The response was immediate. Rural militias mobilized, fearing a crackdown. Rumors of war spread in hours. It became known as the powder alarm, not because of what was lost, but because of what it represented. Control over powder was control over the ability to fight back. And without powder there was no freedom, no survival, no choice. The colonies had inherited this logic from the frontier, where powder wasn't an accessory, it was life itself. Now, towns and counties across America began storing powder in secret, forming powder committees and stockpiling lead, flints, and molds. They had learned well from the forests, from the trading posts, from the tomahawk and the trade gun. The rise of the long rifle. While smoothbore muskets remained common, another weapon had become emblematic of the frontier by the 1770s, the American long rifle. Also called the Kentucky rifle, it was longer and more accurate than a musket, slower to reload, but deadly from 200+ yards. Custom made by German and Swiss gunsmiths in Pennsylvania and Virginia. These rifles were not standard Army issue. They were frontier weapons, often handed down through families or commissioned from local artisans. They were perfect for hunting, ambush, picking off officers from tree lines. In the Revolution, riflemen would become key players, especially in skirmishes and at the edges of formal battles. The gun that had once defended a log cabin now helped defend an idea. Tomahawks in the Revolution. Though muskets and cannons dominated battlefield depictions, the tomahawk never disappeared. Continental soldiers carried them. Militias used them to silently dispatch sentries. Native warriors on both sides used them in traditional and tactical roles. In fact, the tomahawk became a symbol of irregular warfare, personal, close, and psychological. For many native nations, especially those allied with the British, tomahawk warfare remained a cultural constant. For colonial rangers and scouts, it was a practical backup. By the late 1770s, American soldiers in the backcountry regularly carried hatchets or tomahawks on their belts, just as their fathers and grandfathers had on the frontier. Even in Revolution, the old economy of violence continued to function just under new flags. Guns as political tools. Both sides in the revolution tried to control arms flow to shape alliances. The British offered trade guns and powder to native groups willing to attack American settlers. The Continental Congress established Indian commissioners to do the same, though with fewer resources. American rebels seized royal powder stores and distributed them through local militias. Weapons were now more than instruments, they were bribes, threats, and bargaining chips. And as war engulfed the continent, the old patterns returned. Raids on isolated farms, retaliatory burnings of villages, captive taking, scalp bounties, and cross-border smuggling. The revolution didn't replace the frontier war economy, it expanded it. After the revolution, the guns remain. When the war ended in 1783, the United States inherited not just independence, but a landscape shaped by weapons. Trade guns remained in circulation for decades. Militia service was expected from nearly all free men. Private gun ownership, once a survival necessity, was now a civic expectation. Native resistance, far from defeated, continued into the 19th century, and often with guns that had passed through the same old networks. The language of powder and tomahawks never disappeared. It simply shifted dialects. From survival to identity. In time, the tools of frontier violence became symbols of something larger. The long rifle became a mark of American ingenuity. The tomahawk became associated with rugged individualism, even as its origins were erased. The right to bear arms, once about defending against raids, was enshrined as a right to defend against tyranny. And in these mythologies, the frontier economy of violence became national character. Final reflection. In a land where survival once depended on the quiet deal and the loaded musket, the echoes of that world still shape the present. Can a nation born from a powder keg ever fully put down its weapons? Or are we all still living along the old trade routes, speaking a language we no longer remember learning, but have never stopped using? Story 7, Swamp Tactics, the Seminole Resistance. The peninsula now called Florida is often romanticized. Beaches, palm trees, humid air curling through mangroves. But for nearly a century, it was known for something else: resistance. Here, in the tangled swamps and marshes, a people refused to be erased. The Seminoles, a coalition of native refugees, escaped enslaved Africans, and others displaced by conquest, stood against the might of the United States military not once, but 3 times. Their weapons, muskets from traders, blades passed down generations, and most of all, the swamp itself, a natural fortress impenetrable to outsiders, but navigable to those who had learned its breathing rhythm. This is not a tale of decisive battles or dramatic declarations. It's a history of survival through exhaustion, confusion, and sheer familiarity with the land. The making of the Seminoles. The Seminoles did not exist in the early colonial era, not as a unified tribe. They were formed through migration, displacement, and necessity. In the 1700s, members of the Creek Confederacy from Georgia and Alabama moved southward to escape conflict and pressure. Escaped African slaves joined them, forming maroon communities coexisting, intermarrying, and fighting alongside them. Other native refugees, pushed by war or colonization, filtered into the region. By the late 1700s, these diverse groups became known collectively as the Seminoles, from the Spanish Cimarron, meaning wild or runaway. They were not a people defined by borders, but by adaptability, kinship, and shared struggle. They knew the land, and more importantly, they made it a weapon. Florida, the swamp as strategy. To most outsiders, Florida was a nightmare. Thick wetlands choked with sawgrass and snakes. Mosquitoes in swarms so dense they turned skis gray. heat that rusted rifles and rotted boots. But to the Seminoles, it was home. They built villages on high hammocks, slightly elevated patches of land rising above the floodplain. They moved silently through narrow trails, navigated water channels in dugout canoes, and knew where every stream, sinkhole, and spring could hide supplies or shelter. They didn't need walls. The land provided them. This gave them a tactical advantage no military academy could replicate. Outsiders who pursued them quickly found themselves lost, soaked, and sick, their lines stretched, their supplies dwindling, their morale drained. The swamp punished impatience. The First Seminole War, 1817–1818. The United States, newly confident after the War of 1812, turned its attention to Florida, then still a Spanish territory. The Seminoles, harboring escaped slaves and resisting U.S. settlers, became the justification for military intervention. Enter Andrew Jackson. In 1817, Jackson led a force into Spanish Florida with the stated goal of quelling Seminole resistance and capturing fugitive slaves. But this wasn't a war in the traditional sense. There were no lines of battle, no major forts to siege, no surrender ceremonies. Instead, Jackson burned villages, executed tribal leaders, and attacked maroon settlements. His troops struggled in the heat and mud. Disease spread faster than news. Though the Seminoles could not stop the invasion, they didn't surrender. They disappeared into the swamps, drawing Jackson's army into a war of attrition. It ended not with a treaty, but with exhaustion. Spain, weakened and disinterested, soon ceded Florida to the U.S. in 1819. The First Seminole War had accomplished its real aim, territorial acquisition. But the Seminoles remained. Life between wars. In the 1820s and 30s, U.S. policy shifted from war to removal. Under Andrew Jackson's presidency, the Indian Removal Act 1830 was passed, mandating the relocation of native peoples east of the Mississippi to Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma. The Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and others were forced westward, often at gunpoint. The Seminoles were told to go too. But many refused. They had no centralized leadership, no single village or document to be signed. Instead, resistance spread through community whispers, invisible movements, and strategic stalling. They knew the clock was ticking. They watched soldiers arrive. They saw roads being built. And quietly they prepared. Tools of resistance. Seminole resistance wasn't built on massive firepower. It was built on strategy, stealth, and terrain. Weapons included trade muskets, many of them inherited from the British and Spanish. Tomahawks and knives, often customized and sharpened for close ambush. Home-crafted bullets, molded from salvaged lead. Camouflage clothing, dyed with bark and mud to match the swamps. But perhaps the most important weapon was time. The Seminoles could wait. They moved camps regularly. They avoided open conflict. They didn't need to win. They just needed to not lose long enough. Prelude to the Second Seminole War. Tensions escalated in the 1830s as the U.S. began enforcing removal. In 1835, a small event sparked the flame. U.S. Army Major Francis Dade, leading 110 men, was ambushed while marching from Fort Brooke, Tampa, to Fort King, Ocala. Only 3 soldiers survived. It was not just an attack, it was a message. And with that, the Second Seminole War had begun. But this time, the U.S. would find itself in a long, grueling, and deeply unpopular conflict. The swamps were ready, the people were ready, and the war would not go according to plan. Unresolved thought. How do you remove a people who never signed a treaty, never built a city, and never fought by your rules? What happens when resistance doesn't look like rebellion but like refusal to vanish? The year was 1835. And the United States Army, flush with confidence and doctrine from European-style warfare, marched into Florida expecting a swift removal of the Seminole people. What followed was anything but swift. The Second Seminole War, 1835–1842, would become the longest and most expensive Indian conflict in U.S. history, up to that point spanning 7 years, hundreds of engagements, and millions of dollars. But the war would not be defined by pitched battles or sweeping maneuvers. It would be a war of frustration, of weather and water, of soldiers lost in fog, of forts that rotted in silence, and of warriors who struck like lightning and vanished like mist. The Seminoles, never numbering more than a few thousand fighters, would become ghosts of the glades. Ambush in the Palmetto. One of the defining features of Seminole resistance was the ambush, a tactic perfected over generations. They attacked supply lines. They waited in palmetto thickets beside narrow trails. They studied the movement of patrols, striking at their most vulnerable moment. One U.S. officer wrote in frustration, "You do not see them until the first volley, and by the time you respond, they are gone." Unlike European-style combat, where armies met in formation, Seminole tactics relied on fluidity, stealth, and familiarity with terrain. After the Dade Massacre, where 107 of 110 U.S. soldiers were killed, Seminole tactics focused on hit-and-run engagements, often near rivers, swamps, or pine flatwoods, where retreat was easy and cover abundant. They didn't need to kill everyone. They just needed to make progress impossible. The role of Black Seminoles. Perhaps one of the most extraordinary aspects of the war was the presence and leadership of the Black Seminoles, enslaved Africans and freedmen who had integrated into Seminole society. Many had lived with the tribe for generations. Some were born in the swamp, spoke Miccosukee or Creek, and carried weapons passed down from both native and African ancestors. They fought alongside Seminole leaders, conducted reconnaissance, and served as intermediaries in diplomacy and negotiation. They were not auxiliaries. They were core to the Seminole resistance. One leader, Abraham, a Black Seminole interpreter and advisor to Chief Micanopy, played a central role in negotiations, strategy, and diplomacy. The presence of Black fighters enraged many U.S. politicians and generals, who saw the resistance as both racial defiance and political rebellion. In their eyes, the war in Florida was not just a native uprising, it was a multiracial insurgency. And that made it even more dangerous. Fortifying the swamp. The U.S. response was massive. They built over 200 forts across Florida. They cut roads through the wilderness. They deployed more than 30,000 troops over the course of the war. Generals rotated through command: Jessup, Taylor, Armistead, each promising swift victory, each humbled by the swamp. Troops, often new to the terrain, suffered from disease, rot, and despair. Dysentery and malaria took more lives than Seminole gunfire. One soldier, writing from Fort King, described the war as a slow drowning in silence, where each week we lost men not to glory, but to fever and to footsteps vanishing into sawgrass. The Army constructed supply lines and blockhouses, but the Seminoles slipped through. They abandoned villages when discovered. They regrouped deeper in the Everglades. They struck at night, burned hay wagons, and retreated before sunrise. It wasn't war, it was erosion. The betrayal of Osceola. One of the most charismatic and well-known leaders of the resistance was Osceola, a war leader born of mixed Creek and European descent, raised among the Seminoles, and fiercely opposed to removal. Though not a hereditary chief, Osceola quickly rose to prominence during the early years of the war, leading small bands in successful raids and becoming a symbol of unbroken defiance. He was articulate, strategic, and theatrical, often appearing in painted war regalia to speak with U.S. officials. In 1837, under the pretense of peace negotiations, Osceola was invited to parley at Fort Peyton near St. Augustine. He arrived under a flag of truce, and there the U.S. Army seized him. The betrayal outraged many, even within the military. Osceola was imprisoned and transported to Fort Moultrie in South Carolina, where he died of disease months later. His capture was meant to demoralize the resistance, but instead it hardened it. The Seminoles mourned, but they did not surrender. A war without end. As the war dragged on into the early 1840s, the U.S. government shifted tactics. They offered bounties for captured Seminoles. They used bloodhounds imported from Cuba to track fugitives. They encouraged alliances with rival native groups to aid in the search. But despite it all, the Army never conquered the Seminoles. Most of the fighting groups were never captured. Many simply disappeared into the deepest parts of the Everglades, beyond the reach of any campaign. By 1842, Congress had had enough. The cost had become politically intolerable. Tens of millions had been spent. Thousands of soldiers had been cycled through. Florida was still not safe. The war was not won. It was abandoned. The government declared it over. But deep in the swamps, Seminole communities continued, unconquered, unremoved. What the swamp taught. The Second Seminole War did more than scar a territory. It taught a lesson that generations of military planners would revisit. That terrain can defeat an empire. That smaller forces with cultural cohesion and environmental mastery can defy massive armies. That war is not always won on the battlefield, but in the decisions not to surrender, not to leave, not to forget who you are. And for the Seminoles, these were not abstract ideas. They were the reason they still existed. Unresolved thought. If a people can disappear into the land they know, does that count as victory or escape? And if a war ends because one side stops trying, not because the other submits, is the fight ever really over? By 1842, the United States had declared victory in the Second Seminole War. But Florida was not quiet. In the deepest recesses of the Everglades, beyond the reach of forts and roads, a people remained. They had no capital city, no signed treaty, no organized surrender. They had melted into the swamp, into the shadows of cypress domes and mangrove tunnels, living in a rhythm beyond the U.S. Army's understanding. In the official record, the war was over. But in the lives of the Seminoles, it never truly ended. They were now the unconquered. What remained after the war? After 7 years of costly conflict, the United States had forcibly removed over 3,000 Seminoles to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. Some were captured, others were coerced. Many died along the journey west. But several hundred resisted removal. They refused transport, refused compliance, and refused to be found. They remained in small, secretive family groups in southern Florida, in places few outsiders dared to go. These were not warriors seeking battle anymore. They were survivors seeking existence without interference. They lived in Chiquis raised, open-walled dwellings suited to the heat and water. They fished, hunted deer, gathered plants, and maintained oral traditions that traced their defiance across generations. They did not trust visitors. They avoided census takers, traders, and missionaries. For them, survival meant silence and distance. And it worked. The Third Seminole War, 1855–1858. More than a decade later, the fragile peace was broken again not by a battle, but by curiosity. In 1855, a U.S. Army survey team, exploring South Florida for potential development, stumbled upon a Seminole garden near Big Cypress Swamp. Believing the land abandoned, they destroyed the crops and took some possessions. The response was immediate. Seminole warriors ambushed the survey party, killing several and vanishing into the swamp. In retaliation, the U.S. launched another campaign, this time smaller, but equally futile. From 1855 to 1858, skirmishes broke out across the glades. The Army deployed patrols and bloodhounds, but as before, the Seminoles struck and disappeared. The final straw came when Colonel Gustavus Loomis, exasperated, reported that continued pursuit would cost more lives than it could ever justify. And so once again, the U.S. declared victory and left. The Third Seminole War, like the ones before it, ended without surrender. Survival through adaptation. In the decades that followed, the Seminole people adapted to survive. They continued to avoid direct contact with U.S. authorities. Some engaged in trade with frontier settlers, offering crafts, hides, and medicinal plants. Others remained deep in the Everglades, preserving culture in seclusion. Their isolation was strategic. Even as Florida developed railroads, cattle ranges, citrus groves, the Seminoles outweighted the flood of change. By the late 1800s, they numbered in the hundreds, scattered across a shrinking wilderness. But they endured without a treaty, without formal recognition, and without conceding identity. Their legacy became one of the most profound acts of passive resistance in American history. The Seminoles today. In the 20th century, the Seminole story entered a new phase. In 1957, the Seminole tribe of Florida was officially recognized by the U.S. government. In 1962, the Miccosukee tribe followed suit. Today, Seminole communities operate successful ventures, including agriculture, energy, education programs, and yes, the Seminole Hard Rock casinos, a modern symbol of self-determined economic survival. But beneath the headlines and history lies something deeper. The cultural memory of resistance, passed down through generations that remember the swamp as sanctuary. Elders still tell the stories of hiding in the sawgrass, of nights without fire, of bobbies born under the stars, always quiet so the soldiers wouldn't hear. These aren't myths. They are instructions for survival. Weapons that never rusted. In time, the muskets of the Seminole Wars were overtaken by more modern tools, but their impact remained. Weapons literal and cultural used in the resistance included knowledge of the land, passed orally across generations. Tactics of movement, silence, and camouflage, preserved even into the 20th century. A refusal to sign treaties, which paradoxically preserved their sovereignty. Unlike so many tribes forced onto reservations through legally binding documents, the Seminoles, having never signed a treaty of surrender, retained a unique position in American legal history. Their greatest weapon, it turned out, was not the rifle or the tomahawk. It was their patience. A quiet legacy. Today, tourists ride airboats through the Everglades, never knowing how many Seminole families once lived, fought, and hid in those same waters. History books mention Andrew Jackson, Fort King, and the Indian Removal Act, but they often skip the part where the resistance outlasted the empire. The Seminoles were not wiped out. They were not fully removed. They were not assimilated. They endured. Not through conquest, but through quiet refusal. Final reflection. If history is written by the victors, what happens when those who refuse to be conquered never bother to write back? Can resistance live not in battlefields, but in silence, in evasion, in knowing when to disappear? Story 8. Carts, Camps, and Corporals. Logistics of the Continental Army. In the tailies of the American Revolution, you often hear of Valley Forge, Lexington, Yorktown, places where battles were fought and ideals declared. But there's another, less glamorous battlefield, the supply line. The story of the Continental Army is not just one of musket fire and patriotic speeches. It's also one of rotting boots, missing wagons, and frozen beef barrels. It is the story of how an army barely held together by cloth and conviction tried to fight a war of independence without a functioning supply system. And it begins not with bullets but with beans, blankets, and broken carts. The army that wasn't ready. When the Continental Congress formed the Continental Army in 1775, it was a political act more than a logistical one. The colonies were declaring they would stand together, but had almost no idea how to make that work on the ground. George Washington, appointed commander-in-chief, quickly discovered he was in charge of an idea more than an army. What he found was militias in homespun clothes, volunteers with no standard gear, no uniforms, and no food supplies, ammunition scattered across colonies, no central authority to collect, store, or distribute anything essential. And yet, they were expected to face the British, perhaps the most professionally supplied force on the planet at the time. Logistics weren't a side issue, they were the war. What soldiers needed and didn't have. A single Continental soldier ideally required a uniform, shirt, breeches, waistcoat, coat, stockings, and shoes. A musket or rifle plus powder and shot. A haversack for rations. A tent or blanket. Rations, salted meat or fish, hard bread or biscuit, beans, peas, sometimes rice or vinegar. But in reality, many soldiers wore civilian clothing patched, threadbare, and mismatched. Weapons were often borrowed, inherited, or purchased personally. Shoes were a rare luxury. Many fought barefoot, wrapping rags around their feet. Blankets were shared between 3 or more men. Rations ran out constantly. Washington himself described his men as almost naked, living without meat, without shoes, in the frost. Even when Congress allocated supplies, they were often weeks late, misrouted, or stolen en route. It was not an army of glory. It was an army of improvisation. Wagons, roads, and the mud problem. A huge challenge was simply moving things. Colonial roads were narrow, deeply rutted, and often impassable in rain or snow. Wagons broke down constantly. Horses died of overwork or starvation. Without a proper quartermaster corps, the army struggled to maintain reliable convoys. Each regiment often tried to procure its own supplies, leading to hoarding, infighting, and redundancy. In bad weather, supply wagons sank into mud pits. In winter, rivers froze, cutting off key transport routes. In summer, meat spoiled before arrival. It became common for soldiers to eat boiled leather, flour mixed with water, tree bark tea. One officer dryly noted that the most reliable commodity was grumbling. The quartermaster chaos. Early in the war, the quartermaster general position changed hands multiple times. The role included procuring wagons, tents, horses, food, and fuel, coordinating supply routes across colonies, distributing goods fairly among units. But most quartermasters found the job thankless and impossible. Congress delayed funds, local officials withheld resources, and rivalries between colonies made cooperation rare. In one infamous case, no one was responsible for baking bread because it wasn't assigned clearly to any department. The result: entire regiments went hungry while flour sat unused. Washington frequently wrote Congress begging for centralized control over supplies. His request was rarely granted. Without it, he resorted to local impressment, sending soldiers to seize food and livestock from civilians, sometimes without compensation. This bred resentment among the very population the army hoped to defend. Camp life, cold, cramped, and contagious. When not on the move, the Continental Army lived in encampments. Famous among them was Valley Forge, 1777–78, where 12,000 men huddled through a brutal winter with inadequate clothing, no soap, little food, no sanitation infrastructure. Only about 1 in 3 had proper shoes. Disease swept through the ranks: dysentery, typhus, pneumonia, and smallpox. Latrines were dug too close to tents. Wood for fires was scarce. Blankets were infested with lice. Medical supplies were rudimentary or non-existent. And yet the army endured, partly because of sheer necessity, and partly due to leadership from figures like Baron von Steuben, who arrived at Valley Forge and began drilling men in hygiene, order, and routine as much as in battlefield tactics. He insisted on latrines placed at proper distances, regular washing when possible, orderly food distribution, chain of command in camp life. These boring measures saved lives. The commissary catastrophe. In theory, the commissary department was meant to procure and distribute food and forage. In practice, it was a disaster. Shortages of funds meant commissaries couldn't pay suppliers. Farmers often preferred to sell to British forces, who paid in gold or silver. Storage depots were looted, mismanaged, or placed in unsafe zones. In the southern campaigns, the situation worsened. Soldiers often lived entirely off local foraging, which burned bridges with civilians and led to starvation when regions were stripped bare. In the north, soldiers were sometimes issued fire cake, a mix of flour and water cooked on stones, too hard to chew but enough to stave off death. There were no feast days in the Continental Army. Every day was a logistical gamble, a slow marching miracle. Despite all this, despite the hunger, cold, disease, and chaos, the Continental Army survived. Not because of superior weapons, not because of perfect planning, but because of adaptation, endurance, and ingenuity. Officers took to repairing wagons themselves. Soldiers built shoes from animal hides. Camp followers, women and children who traveled with the army, cooked, washed, and nursed, forming the invisible backbone of survival. And commanders slowly learned which roads could be trusted, which towns would cooperate, which systems worked, and which needed burning down. War is often won by those who can keep moving, eating, and not dying of cold just long enough to reach the next battle. The Continental Army proved that logistics, not glory, carried the revolution forward. Unresolved thought. If revolution depends on high ideals, how much of its survival comes down to the lowest, dirtiest details? When supply lines fail and feet bleed through rags, is it belief that sustains an army, or is it just the ability to boil flour and find dry wood? By 1778, the Revolutionary War had entered a new phase. The Battle of Saratoga had convinced France to join the war effort. Supplies, advisors, and the occasional ship of gold began trickling in. But for George Washington and the men on the ground, little changed immediately. The war was still being fought one sack of flour at a time. The core problem remained: how to get things to where they needed to be on time, intact, and in usable condition. You cannot win a war on letters and lanterns alone. You win it with mules, boats, hoarded salt, and men who knew how to build a cart from a broken fence. Salt, the strategic mineral. Perhaps no single item exemplifies the strange logistics of the war more than salt. Salt was not just a seasoning, it was a preservative, a currency, and a military necessity. Without it, meat spoiled in days. Wounds festered faster. Horses and mules weakened. But Britain controlled major ports and saltworks, and blockades cut off much of the salt trade. Thus, continental agents scoured remote caves, coastal flats, and even built temporary saltworks along rivers to boil brine. Barrels of salt were escorted with military guards, as if they were gold. In some winter campaigns, Washington's army operated with less than 1 ounce of salt per soldier per week. Salt determined how long they could stay in one place, or whether their food would survive a march. In some respect, salt was strategy. Shoes and the American foot problem. As the war dragged on, one item was always in short supply: shoes. Imported leather was rare. Domestic production was minimal. British raids destroyed cobbler shops. Many soldiers marched in open sandals or wrapped feet in rawhide, which stiffened in cold and cut into flesh. During winter campaigns, it wasn't uncommon for men to leave bloody footprints in the snow. In 1780, Washington wrote to Congress begging for that article of absolute necessity, without which men are rendered unfit to move. Shoemakers were sometimes forcibly recruited to join the army not as fighters, but as emergency suppliers. And still, shoes remained a fantasy for many. Some soldiers traded their rations for a second-hand pair. Others simply marched on wounded feet. Camp followers, the invisible labor force. While formal logistics floundered, another force quietly kept the army alive: camp followers. These were not soldiers, they were wives of enlisted men, widows seeking protection, children too young to be left behind, free and enslaved African Americans who saw opportunity or safety in the army's shadow. They cooked, they washed clothing, they mended uniforms, they helped with wounded men. In some cases, women were issued half rations and shelter in return for their labor. Some, like Mary Ludwig Hayes, often called Molly Pitcher, carried water to artillerymen and braved enemy fire to keep the guns cool. But most remained unnamed, undocumented. Their labor was essential, but unofficial, the kind that doesn't get medals but keeps the entire army from collapse. Without them, the army would have disintegrated in camp long before it reached the battlefield. Boats, rafts, and riverways. While poor roads plagued overland supply, rivers offered a lifeline when used wisely. The Continental Army increasingly relied on bateaux, flat-bottomed boats, ideal for transporting goods on shallow rivers. These boats carried powder kegs, musket balls, and dried corn. Teams built and piloted them upriver to supply isolated forts and outposts. In spring, river floods made them risky but faster. In winter, ice halted traffic entirely. In key campaigns like those in the Hudson Valley and around Fort Ticonderoga, river logistics were the difference between holding a post or abandoning it. Unfortunately, boat crews were hard to retain. Many were local civilians or impressed workers, and desertion was common. When river traffic halted, some units faced weeks without resupply. Thus, rivers were both artery and vulnerability, a double-edged lifeline. The commissary reforms too little too late. By 1780, Congress finally recognized that its piecemeal approach wasn't working. It enacted reforms to centralize logistics under more competent leadership, including the appointment of Nathanael Greene as Quartermaster General. Greene, known for discipline and detail, overhauled warehouse organization, procurement contracts, transportation routes. He implemented receipts, logs, and distribution schedules, basic things, but revolutionary for a system previously held together by guesswork. Under his reforms, wagons were routed more effectively. Forts received more consistent rations. Commanders had better data on available supplies. And yet the war was already winding down. Victory at Yorktown, 1781, was as much about French support and British overreach as it was about domestic logistics. Greene's reforms stabilized the army, but they could not erase years of hunger, rot, and frostbite. Uniforms, a patchwork of patriotism. In popular art, the Continental soldier is clad in blue with white trim. In reality, the Army's clothing was a riot of inconsistency. Some wore dyed hunting shirts. Others wore civilian coats with sewn-on buttons. Regiments in the South often wore nothing but breeches and linen shirts in summer heat. When France began supplying uniforms, blue coats with red facings became more common but never universal. To outsiders, Continental soldiers looked disorganized. To insiders, each coat told a story. Of a farm left behind. Of a battle survived. Of a family that stitched it before the march. Uniformity wasn't in their clothing, it was in their cause. An army of scavengers. By late in the war, the Army had become resourceful to the point of absurdity. Buttons were made from bone. Broken muskets were cannibalized for parts. Blankets were patched into tents. Officers bought maps from tavern owners and post riders. Washington, ever practical, tolerated looting of British supplies so long as it was orderly. In fact, one of the most celebrated moments after the Yorktown siege was not the surrender but the capture of British supply wagons. For soldiers who had eaten moldy hardtack and marched barefoot for months, those wagons meant shoes, food, powder, soap. They had survived the war not because of supply, but despite it. Unresolved thought. What does it say about a revolution that it was carried on the shoulders of people who rarely had boots, and whose survival depended on sewing needles more than bayonets? Can a nation born from such scarcity ever truly forget what it took to feed its first army? By 1781, the American Revolution had become a war of endurance. The Continental Army was no longer a ragged band of amateurs, but it was also not a polished war machine. Its victories were still measured in inches, not miles, and many of those inches came at the cost of supply wagons that never arrived or boots that fell apart during a march. Victory at Yorktown didn't come from an abundance of food or firepower. It came from a confluence of timing, foreign aid, and logistical improvisation fitting for an army that had never relied on comfort. Now, in the final years of the war, it was time to feed the victory literally. Yorktown, the siege fueled by French bread and borrowed carts. The Siege of Yorktown, 1781, is often told as a tale of strategy and surrender. But behind the musket lines and cannon fire was a monumental logistical effort. Washington's army had to march hundreds of miles south from New York to Virginia. They needed food, ammunition, horses, and medical supplies. The French army, under Rochambeau, brought both material and logistical competence. Together, they pulled off one of the most complex troop movements of the war. French engineers built bridges across rivers. French supply officers coordinated ships that delivered flour and salted meat. Local American militias were called upon to gather wagons, often from reluctant farmers. Washington's officers scouted routes not for safety, but for wagon suitability. Rains nearly derailed the entire effort, roads turned to sludge, and supply trains bogged down. But they kept moving. By the time they reached Yorktown, the army was underfed, underdressed but together and armed. It was enough. After the victory, still hungry. One might assume that Yorktown's surrender signaled the end of logistical hardship. It did not. Even after victory, supply warehouses were empty. Congress was bankrupt. Soldiers went months without pay. In 1783, 2 years after Yorktown, the Newburgh Conspiracy emerged. Anxious officers, tired of broken promises and unpaid wages, considered marching on Congress itself. Washington intervened, not with threats but with tears. In a famous moment, he addressed his officers and pulled out a pair of reading glasses, saying, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, For I have not only grown gray but almost blind in the service of my country." That moment calmed the storm, the conspiracy dissolved. But the underlying truth remained. The army had fought and bled for a nation that still didn't know how to feed or clothe it. The logistics of disbanding. Even ending the war required logistical planning. Troops had to be discharged and sent home, often with no provisions or support. Weapons and uniforms were returned in various states of disrepair, or not returned at all. Records of service, crucial for later pensions, were often lost or never written. Some veterans walked hundreds of miles home barefoot. Many arrived to find farms seized, families displaced, or debts accumulated during their service. Congress authorized land grants in place of pay, but many soldiers had no means to travel west or the legal knowledge to claim their plots. The final logistics of war, reintegrating a generation of veterans into a fragile economy, was perhaps the most neglected. Long-term consequences, lessons and legacies. The logistical failures of the Revolutionary War had lasting consequences. The Constitution itself emerged in part to solve the chaos of supply and finance. The Articles of Confederation had proven unable to tax or support a national army. The U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps was formalized in the 19th century, heavily influenced by the lessons of 1775-1783. Military leaders like Nathanael Greene became case studies in how to succeed not by winning battles, but by moving armies that should have collapsed. Veterans, organizations began forming, advocating for pensions, land, and recognition. And perhaps most enduring, the idea that national defense depends not only on courage, but on organization, supply, and the people who labor unseen. The myth and the mud. It's easy to think of the Continental Army as heroic, and it was. But heroism didn't always look like bayonet charges or flag waving. More often it looked like a teenager driving a broken cart through freezing rain, a woman sewing torn trousers by firelight while her children cried of hunger, a soldier eating fire cake 3 nights in a row and waking up to dig a new latrine. This is the boring truth of war. The fight is not just at the front. It's in the quartermaster's book, the blacksmith's forge, the icy stream where shirts are washed, the ration barrel filled with weevils. It's in every place that doesn't make it onto the map. Final reflection. When we picture freedom being born, we often see muskets raised and flags waving. But maybe, more than anything, freedom was sown, boiled, dragged, patched, and carried through mud by people who knew they might never see the fruits of their labor, only the weight of it.